Chapter 40 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 40. Some of the ceremonies in a man of war unnecessary and injurious. The ceremonials of a man of war, some of which have been described in the preceding chapter, may merit a reflection or two. The general usages of the American Navy are founded upon the usages that prevailed in the Navy of monarchical England more than a century ago, nor have they been materially altered since. And while both England and America have become greatly liberalized in the interval, while shore pomp in high places has come to be regarded by the more intelligent masses of men as belonging to the absurd, ridiculous, and mock-heroic, while that most truly august of all the majesties of earth, the President of the United States, may be seen entering his residence with his umbrella under his arm, and no brass band or military guard at his heels, and unostentatiously taking his seat by the side of the meanest citizen in a public conveyance, while this is the case, there still lingers in American men of war all the stilted etiquette and childish parade of the old-fashioned Spanish court of Madrid. Indeed, so far as the things that meet the eye are concerned, an American Commodore is by far a greater man than the President of 20 millions of freemen. But we plain people ashore might very willingly be content to leave these Commodores in the unmolested possession of their gilded penny whistles, rattles, and gewgaws, since they seem to take so much pleasure in them, were it not that all this is attended by consequences to their subordinates in the last degree to be deplored. While hardly anyone will question that a naval officer should be surrounded by circumstances calculated to impart a requisite dignity to his position, it is not the less certain that, by the excessive pomp he at present maintains, there is naturally and unavoidably generated a feeling of servility and debasement in the hearts of most of the seamen who continually behold a fellow mortal flourishing over their heads like the archangel Michael with 1,000 wings. And as in degree this same pomp is observed toward their inferiors by all the grades of commissioned officers, even down to a midshipman, the evil is proportionately multiplied. It would not at all diminish a proper respect for the officers and subordination to their authority among the seamen were all this idle parade, only ministering to the arrogance of the officers, without at all benefiting the state, completely done away. But to do so, we voters and lawgivers ourselves must be no respecters of persons. That saying about leveling upward and not downward may seem very fine to those who cannot see its self-involved absurdity. But the truth is that, to gain the true level in some things, we must cut downward. For how can you make every sailor a Commodore? Or how raise the valleys without filling them up with the superfluous tops of the hills? Some discreet but democratic legislation in this matter is much to be desired. And by bringing down naval officers in these things at least, without affecting their legitimate dignity and authority, we shall correspondingly elevate the common sailor without relaxing the subordination in which he should by all means be retained. End of Chapter 40. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 41 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 41. A Man of War Library. Nowhere does time pass more heavily than with most men of war's men on board their craft in harbor. One of my principal antidotes against ennui in Rio was reading. There was a public library on board, paid for by government, and entrusted to the custody of one of the marine corporals, a little dried-up man of a somewhat literary turn. He had once been a clerk in a post-office ashore, and, having been long accustomed to hand over letters when called for, he was now just the man to hand over books. He kept them in a large cask on the berth deck, and, when seeking a particular volume, had to capsize it like a barrel of potatoes. This made him very cross and irritable, as most all librarians are. Who had the selection of these books I do not know, but some of them must have been selected by our chaplain, who so pranced on Coleridge's High German horse. Mason Goode's Book of Nature, a very good book to be sure, but not precisely adapted to Terry tastes, was one of these volumes, and Machiavel's Art of War, which was very dry fighting, and a folio of Tillotson's Sermons, the best of reading for divines, indeed, but with little relish for a maintopman, and Locke's Essays, incomparable essays, everybody knows, but miserable reading at sea, and Plutarch's Lives, super excellent biographies, which pit Greek against Roman in beautiful style, but then, in a sailor's estimation, not to be mentioned with the Lives of the Admirals, and Blair's Lectures, University edition, a fine treatise on rhetoric, but having nothing to say about nautical phrases such as splicing the main brace, passing a gammoning, puddinging the dolphin, and making a carrack bend, besides numerous invaluable but unreadable tomes that might have been purchased cheap at the auction of some college professor's library. But I found ample entertainment in a few choice old authors, whom I stumbled upon in various parts of the ship among the inferior officers. One was Morgan's History of Algiers, a famous old quarto, abounding in picturesque narratives of corsairs, captives, dungeons, and sea fights, and making mention of a cruel old Dey who, toward the latter part of his life, was so filled with remorse for his cruelties and crimes that he could not stay in bed after 4 o'clock in the morning, but had to rise in great trepidation and walk off his bad feelings till breakfast time. And another venerable octavo, containing a certificate from Sir Christopher Wren to its authenticity, entitled Knox's Captivity in Ceylon, 1681, abounding in stories about the devil, who was superstitiously supposed to tyrannize over that unfortunate land. To mollify him, the priests offered up buttermilk, red cocks, and sausages, and the devil ran roaring about in the woods, frightening travelers out of their wits, insomuch that the islanders bitterly lamented to Knox that their country was full of devils, and consequently there was no hope for their eventual well-being. Knox swears that he himself heard the devil roar, though he did not see his horns. It was a terrible noise, he says, like the baying of a hungry mastiff. Then there was Walpole's Letters, very witty, pert, and polite, and some odd volumes of plays, each of which was a precious casket of jewels of good things, shaming the trash nowadays passed off for dramas, containing The Jew of Malta, Old Fortunatus, The City Madam, Volpone, The Alchemist, and other glorious old dramas of the age of Marlowe and Johnson, and that literary Damon and Pythias, the magnificent, mellow old Beaumont and Fletcher, who have sent the long shadow of their reputation side by side with Shakespeare's, far down the endless vale of posterity. And may that shadow never be less. But as for St. Shakespeare, may his never be more, lest the commentators arise, and settling upon his sacred text like unto locusts, devour it clean up, leaving never a dot over an I. I diversified this reading of mine by borrowing Moore's Loves of the Angels from Rosewater, who recommended it as the charmingest of volumes, and a Negro songbook containing Sittin' on a Rail, Gumbo Squash, and Jim Along Josie from Broadbit, a street anchor man. The sad taste of this old tar in admiring such vulgar stuff was much denounced by Rosewater, whose own predilections were of a more elegant nature, as evinced by his exalted opinion of the literary merits of the Loves of the Angels. I was by no means the only reader of books on board the Neversink. Several other sailors were diligent readers, though their studies did not lie in the way of belles letters. Their favorite authors were such as you may find at the bookstalls around Fulton Market. They were slightly physiological in their nature. My book experiences on board of the frigate proved an example of a fact which every book lover must have experienced before me, namely, that though public libraries have an imposing air, and doubtless contain invaluable volumes, yet somehow the books that prove most agreeable, grateful, and companionable are those we pick up by chance here and there, those which seem put into our hands by Providence, those which pretend to little, but abound in much. End of Chapter 41. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 42 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 42. Killing Time in a Man of War in Harbor. Reading was by no means the only method adopted by my shipmates in whiling away the long, tedious hours in harbor. In truth, many of them could not have read, had they wanted to, ever so much. In early youth their primers had been sadly neglected. Still, they had other pursuits. Some were experts at the needle, and employed their time in making elaborate shirts, stitching picturesque eagles and anchors, and all the stars of the Federated States in the collars thereof, so that when they at last completed and put on these shirts, they may be said to have hoisted the American colors. Others excelled in tattooing, or pricking, as it is called in a man of war. Of these prickers, two had long been celebrated, in their way, as consummate masters of the art. Each had a small box full of tools and coloring matter, and they charged so high for their services that at the end of the cruise they were supposed to have cleared upward of $400. They would prick you to order a palm tree, or an anchor, a crucifix, a lady, a lion, an eagle, or anything else you might want. The Roman Catholic sailors on board had at least the crucifix pricked on their arms, and for this reason. If they chanced to die in a Catholic land, they would be sure of a decent burial in consecrated ground, as the priest would be sure to observe the symbol of Mother Church on their persons. They would not fare as Protestant sailors dying in Callao, who are shoved under the sands of St. Lorenzo, a solitary volcanic island in the harbor, overrun with reptiles, their heretical bodies not being permitted to repose in the more genial loam of Lima. And many sailors not Catholics were anxious to have the crucifix painted on them, owing to a curious superstition of theirs. They affirm, some of them, that if you have that mark tattooed upon all four limbs, you might fall overboard among 775,000 white sharks, all dinnerless, and not one of them would so much as dare to smell at your little finger. We had one foretopman on board, who, during the entire cruise, was having an endless cable pricked round and round his wrist, so that when his frock was off, he looked like a capstan with a hawser coiled round about it. This foretopman paid 18 pence per link for the cable, besides being on the smart the whole cruise, suffering the effects of his repeated puncturings. So he paid very dear for his cable. One other mode of passing time while in port was cleaning and polishing your bright work, for it must be known that, in men of war, every sailor has some brass or steel of one kind or another to keep in high order, like housemaids, whose business it is to keep well polished the knobs on the front door railing and the parlor grates. Excepting the ring bolts, eye bolts, and belaying pins scattered about the decks, this bright work, as it is called, is principally about the guns, embracing the monkey tails of the carronades, the screws, prickers, little irons, and other things. The portion that fell to my own share I kept in superior order, quite equal in polish to Roger's best cutlery. I received the most extravagant encomiums from the officers, one of whom offered to match me against any brazier or brass polisher in her British Majesty's Navy. Indeed, I devoted myself to the work body and soul, and thought no pains too painful and no labor too laborious to achieve the highest attainable polish possible for us poor lost sons of Adam to reach. Upon one occasion, even when woolen rags were scarce, and no burned brick was to be had from the ship's yeoman, I sacrificed the corners of my woolen shirt, and used some dentrifice I had as substitutes for rags and burned brick. The dentrifice operated delightfully, and made the threading of my carronade screw shine and grin again, like a set of false teeth in an eager heiress hunter's mouth. Still another mode of passing time was arraying yourself in your best togs, and promenading up and down the gun-deck, admiring the shore scenery from the port-holes, which, in an amphitheatrical bay like Rio, belted about by the most varied and charming scenery of hill, dale, moss, meadow, court, castle, tower, grove, vine, vineyard, aqueduct, palace, square, island, fort, is very much like lounging round a circular cosmorama, and ever and anon lazily peeping through the glasses here and there. Oh, there is something worth living for, even in our man-of-war world, and one glimpse of a bower of grapes, though a cable's length off, is almost satisfaction for dining off a shank bone salted down. This promenading was chiefly patronized by the marines, and particularly by Colebrook, a remarkably handsome and very gentlemanly corporal among them. He was a complete ladies' man, with fine black eyes, bright red cheeks, glossy jet whiskers, and a refined organization of the whole man. He used to array himself in his regimentals, and saunter about like an officer of the Coldstream Guards, strolling down to his club in St. James's. Every time he passed me, he would heave a sentimental sigh, and hum to himself the girl I left behind me. This fine corporal afterward became a representative in the legislature of the state of New Jersey, for I saw his name returned about a year after my return home. But, after all, there was not much room, while in port, for promenading, at least on the gun-deck, for the whole larboard side is kept clear for the benefit of the officers, who appreciate the advantages of having a clear stroll fore and aft. And they well know that the sailors had much better be crowded together on the other side than that the set of their own coat-tails should be impaired by brushing against their tarry trousers. One other way of killing time while in port is playing checkers, that is, when it is permitted, for it is not every navy captain who will allow such a scandalous proceeding. But as for Captain Claret, though he did like his glass of Madeira uncommonly well, and was an undoubted descendant from the hero of the Battle of the Brandywine, and though he sometimes showed a suspiciously flushed face when superintending in person the flogging of a sailor for getting intoxicated against his particular orders, yet I will say for Captain Claret that, upon the whole, he was rather indulgent to his crew, so long as they were perfectly docile. He allowed them to play checkers as much as they pleased. More than once I have known him, when going forward to the forecastle, pick his way carefully among scores of canvas checker cloths spread upon the deck, so as not to tread upon the men, the checkermen and man-of-war's men included. But in a certain sense they were both one, for as the sailors used their checkermen, so at quarters their officers used these men-of-war's men. But Captain Claret's leniency in permitting checkers on board his ship might have arisen from the following little circumstance, confidentially communicated to me. Soon after the ship had sailed from home, checkers were prohibited, whereupon the sailors were exasperated against the captain, and one night, when he was walking round the forecastle, bim! came an iron belaying pin past his ears, and while he was dodging that, bim! came another from the other side, so that, it being a very dark night, and nobody to be seen, and it being impossible to find out the trespassers, he thought it best to get back into his cabin as soon as possible. Some time after, just as if the belaying pins had nothing to do with it, it was indirectly rumored that the checkerboards might be brought out again, which, as a philosophical shipmate observed, showed that Captain Claret was a man of a ready understanding, and could understand a hint as well as any other man, even when conveyed by several pounds of iron. Some of the sailors were very precise about their checker cloths, and even went so far that they would not let you play with them unless you first washed your hands, especially if so be you had just come from tarring down the rigging. Another way of beguiling the tedious hours is to get a cozy seat somewhere and fall into as snug a little reverie as you can. Or, if a seat is not to be had, which is frequently the case, then get a tolerably comfortable stand-up against the bulwarks, and begin to think about home and bread and butter, always inseparably connected to a wanderer, which will very soon bring delicious tears into your eyes. For everyone knows what a luxury is grief, when you can get a private closet to enjoy it in, and no Paul Pry's intrude. Several of my shore friends, indeed, when suddenly overwhelmed by some disaster, always make a point of flying to the first oyster cellar, and shutting themselves up in a box with nothing but a plate of stewed oysters, some crackers, the castor, and a decanter of old port. Still another way of killing time in harbor is to lean over the bulwarks and speculate upon where, under the sun, you are going to be that day next year, which is a subject full of interest to every living soul, so much so that there is a particular day of a particular month of the year, which, from my earliest recollections, I have always kept the run of, so that I can even now tell just where I was on that identical day of every year past since I was 12 years old. And, when I am all alone, to run over this almanac in my mind is almost as interesting as to read your own diary, and far more interesting than to peruse a table of logarithms on a rainy afternoon. I always keep the anniversary of that day with lamb and peas, and a pint of sherry, for it comes in spring, but when it came round in the Neversink, I could get neither lamb, peas, nor sherry. But perhaps the best way to drive the hours before you four in hand is to select a soft plank on the gun-deck and go to sleep. A fine specific which seldom fails unless, to be sure, you have been sleeping all the 24 hours beforehand. Whenever employed in killing time in harbor, I have lifted myself up on my elbow and looked around me, and seen so many of my shipmates all employed at the same common business, all under lock and key, all hopeless prisoners like myself, all under martial law, all dieting on salt beef and biscuit, all in one uniform, all yawning, gaping, and stretching in concert. It was then that I used to feel a certain love and affection for them, grounded, doubtless, on a fellow feeling. And though, in a previous part of this narrative, I have mentioned that I used to hold myself somewhat aloof from the mass of seamen on board the Neversink, and though this was true, and my real acquaintances were comparatively few, and my intimates still fewer, yet, to tell the truth, it is quite impossible to live so long with 500 of your fellow beings, even if not of the best families in the land, and with morals that would not be spoiled by further cultivation. It is quite impossible, I say, to live with 500 of your fellow beings, be they who they may, without feeling a common sympathy with them at the time, and ever after cherishing some sort of interest in their welfare. The truth of this was curiously corroborated by a rather equivocal acquaintance of mine, who, among the men, went by the name of Shakings. He belonged to the forehold, whence of a dark night he would sometimes emerge to chat with the sailors on deck. I never liked the man's looks. I protest it was a mere accident that gave me the honor of his acquaintance, and generally I did my best to avoid him, when he would come skulking like a jailbird out of his den into the liberal open air of the sky. Nevertheless, the anecdote this holder told me is well worth preserving, more especially the extraordinary frankness evinced in his narrating such a thing to a comparative stranger. The substance of his story was as follows. Shakings, it seems, had once been a convict in the New York State's prison at Sing Sing, where he had been for years confined for a crime which he gave me his solemn word of honor he was wholly innocent of. He told me that, after his term had expired, and he went out into the world again, he never could stumble upon any of his old Sing Sing associates without dropping into a public-house and talking over old times. And when fortune would go hard with him, and he felt out of sorts and incensed at matters and things in general, he told me that at such time he almost wished he was back again in Sing Sing, where he was relieved from all anxieties about what he should eat and drink, and was supported, like the President of the United States and Prince Albert, at the public charge. He used to have such a snug little cell, he said, all to himself, and never felt afraid of housebreakers, for the walls were uncommonly thick, and his door was securely bolted for him, and a watchman was all the time walking up and down in the passage, while he himself was fast asleep and dreaming. To this, in substance, the holder added that he narrated this anecdote because he thought it applicable to a man-of-war, which he scandalously asserted to be a sort of state prison afloat. Concerning the curious disposition to fraternize and be sociable, which this Shakings mentioned as characteristic of the convicts liberated from his old homestead at Sing Sing, it may well be asked whether it may not prove to be some feeling, somehow akin to the reminiscent impulses which influence them, that shall hereafter fraternally reunite all us mortals, when we shall have exchanged this state's prison man-of-war world of ours for another and a better. From the foregoing account of the great difficulty we had in killing time while in port, it must not be inferred that on board of the Neversink in Rio there was literally no work to be done. At long intervals the launch would come alongside with water casks, to be emptied into iron tanks in the hold. In this way, nearly 50,000 gallons, as chronicled in the books of the master's mate, were decanted into the ship's bowels, a 90 days' allowance. With this huge Lake Ontario in us, the mighty Neversink might be said to resemble the united continent of the Eastern Hemisphere, floating in a vast ocean herself, and having a Mediterranean floating in her. End of Chapter 42. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 43 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 43. Smuggling in a Man of War. It is in a good degree owing to the idleness just described, that, while lying in harbor, the man-of-war's man is exposed to the most temptations, and gets into his saddest scrapes. For though his vessel be anchored a mile from the shore, and her sides are patrolled by sentries night and day, yet these things cannot entirely prevent the seductions of the land from reaching him. The prime agent in working his calamities in port is his old arch-enemy, the ever-devilish god of grog. Immured as the man-of-war's man is, serving out his weary 3 years in a sort of sea Newgate from which he cannot escape, either by the roof or burrowing underground, he too often flies to the bottle to seek relief from the intolerable ennui of nothing to do and nowhere to go. His ordinary government allowance of spirits, 1 gill per diem, is not enough to give a sufficient to his listless senses. He pronounces his grog basely watered. He scouts at it as thinner than muslin. He craves a more vigorous nip at the cable, a more sturdy swig at the halyards. And if opium were to be had, many would steep themselves 1,000 fathoms down in the densest fumes of that oblivious drug. Tell him that the delirium tremens and the mania a potu lie in ambush for drunkards, he will say to you, "Let them bear down upon me, then, before the wind. Anything that smacks of life is better than to feel Davy Jones' chest-lid on your nose." He is reckless as an avalanche, and though his fall destroy himself and others, yet a ruinous commotion is better than being frozen fast in unendurable solitudes. No wonder, then, that he goes all lengths to procure the thing he craves. No wonder that he pays the most exorbitant prices, breaks through all law, and braves the ignominious lash itself, rather than be deprived of his stimulus. Now, concerning no one thing in a man-of-war are the regulations more severe than respecting the smuggling of grog, and being found intoxicated. For either offence there is but one penalty, invariably enforced, and that is the degradation of the gangway. All conceivable precautions are taken by most frigate executives to guard against the secret admission of spirits into the vessel. In the first place, no shore-boat whatever is allowed to approach a man-of-war in a foreign harbor without permission from the officer of the deck. Even the bum-boats, the small craft licensed by the officers to bring off fruit for the sailors, to be bought out of their own money, these are invariably inspected before permitted to hold intercourse with the ship's company. And not only this, but every one of the numerous ship's boats, kept almost continually plying to and from the shore, are similarly inspected, sometimes each boat 20 times in the day. This inspection is thus performed. The boat being decried by the quartermaster from the poop, she is reported to the deck officer, who thereupon summons the master-at-arms, the ship's chief of police. This functionary now stations himself at the gangway, and as the boat's crew one by one come up the side, he personally overhauls them, making them take off their hats, and then, placing both hands upon their heads, draws his palms slowly down to their feet, carefully feeling all unusual protuberances. If nothing suspicious is felt, the man is let pass, and so on, till the whole boat's crew, averaging about 16 men, are examined. The chief of police then descends into the boat, and walks from stem to stern, eyeing it all over, and poking his long rattan into every nook and cranny. This operation concluded, and nothing found, he mounts the ladder, touches his hat to the deck officer, and reports the boat clean, whereupon she is hauled out to the booms. Thus it will be seen that not a man of the ship's company ever enters the vessel from shore without it being rendered next to impossible, apparently, that he should have succeeded in smuggling anything. Those individuals who are permitted to board the ship without undergoing this ordeal are only persons whom it would be preposterous to search, such as the Commodore himself, the captain, lieutenants, etc., and gentlemen and ladies coming as visitors. for anything to be clandestinely thrust through the lower portholes at night is rendered very difficult, from the watchfulness of the quartermaster in hailing all boats that approach long before they draw alongside, and the vigilance of the sentries posted on platforms overhanging the water, whose orders are to fire into a strange boat which, after being warned to withdraw, should still persist in drawing nigh. Moreover, 32-pound shots are slung to ropes and suspended over the bows to drop a hole into and sink any small craft which, spite of all precautions, by strategy should succeed in getting under the bows with liquor by night. Indeed, the whole power of martial law is enlisted in this matter, and every one of the numerous officers of the ship, besides his general zeal in enforcing the regulations, adds to that a personal feeling, since the sobriety of the men abridges his own cares and anxieties. How, then, it will be asked, in the face of an Argus-eyed police, and in defiance even of bayonets and bullets, do men-of-war's men contrive to smuggle their spirits? Not to enlarge upon minor stratagems, every few days detected and rendered naught, such as rolling up in a handkerchief a long slender skin of grog, like a sausage, and in that manner ascending to the deck out of a boat just from shore, or openly bringing on board cocoanuts and melons, procured from a knavish bumboat filled with spirits instead of milk or water. We will only mention here 2 or 3 other modes coming under my own observation. While in Rio, a foretopman belonging to the second cutter paid down the money, and made an arrangement with a person encountered at the Palace landing ashore, to the following effect. Of a certain moonless night, he was to bring off 3 gallons of spirits, in skins, and moor them to the frigate's anchor buoy, some distance from the vessel, attaching something heavy to sink them out of sight. In the middle watch of the night, the foretopman slips out of his hammock, and by creeping along in the shadows, eludes the vigilance of the master-at-arms and his mates, gains a port-hole, and softly lowers himself into the water, almost without creating a ripple, the sentries marching to and fro on their overhanging platform above him. He is an expert swimmer, and paddles along under the surface, every now and then rising a little, and lying motionless on his back to breathe, little but his nose exposed. The buoy gained, he cuts the skins adrift, ties them round his body, and in the same adroit manner makes good his return. This feat is very seldom attempted, for it needs the utmost caution, address, and dexterity, and no one but a super-expert burglar and faultless Leander of a swimmer could achieve it. From the greater privileges which they enjoy, the forward officers, that is, the gunner, boatswain, etc., have much greater opportunities for successful smuggling than the common seamen. Coming alongside one night in a cutter, Yarn, our boatswain, in some inexplicable way, contrived to slip several skins of brandy through the airport of his own state-room. The feat, however, must have been perceived by one of the boat's crew, who, immediately on gaining the deck, sprung down the ladders, stole into the boatswain's room, and made away with the prize, not 3 minutes before the rightful owner entered to claim it. Though, from certain circumstances, the thief was known to the aggrieved party, yet the latter could say nothing, since he himself had infringed the law. But the next day, in the capacity of captain of the ship's executioners, Yarn had the satisfaction, it was so to him, of standing over the robber at the gangway, for, being found intoxicated with the very liquor the boatswain himself had smuggled, the man had been condemned to a flogging. This recalls another instance, still more illustrative of the knotted, trebly intertwisted villainy accumulating at a sort of compound interest in a man-of-war. The coxswain of the Commodore's barge takes his crew apart, one by one, and cautiously sounds them as to their fidelity, not to the United States of America, but to himself. 3 individuals, whom he deems doubtful, that is, faithful to the United States of America, he procures to be discharged from the barge, and men of his own selection are substituted, for he is always an influential character, this coxswain of the Commodore's barge. Previous to this, however, he has seen to it well that no temperance men, that is, sailors who do not draw their government ration of grog, but take the money for it, he has seen to it that none of these balkers are numbered among his crew. Having now proved his men, he divulges his plan to the assembled body. A solemn oath of secrecy is obtained, and he waits the first fit opportunity to carry into execution his nefarious designs. At last it comes. One afternoon, the barge carries the Commodore across the bay to a fine waterside settlement of noblemen's seats called Praia Grande. The Commodore is visiting a Portuguese marquis, and the pair linger long over their dinner in an arbor in the garden. Meanwhile, the coxswain has liberty to roam about where he pleases. He searches out a place where some choice red-eye brandy is to be had, purchases 6 large bottles, and conceals them among the trees. Under the pretense of filling the boat keg with water, which is always kept in the barge to refresh the crew, he now carries it off into the grove, knocks out the head, puts the bottles inside, reheads the keg, fills it with water, carries it down to the boat, and audaciously restores it to its conspicuous position in the middle, with its bunghole up. When the Commodore comes down to the beach, and they pull off for the ship, the coxswain, in a loud voice, commands the nearest man to take that bung out of the keg, that precious water will spoil. Arrived alongside the frigate, the boat's crew are overhauled, as usual, at the gangway, and nothing being found on them, are passed. The master-at-arms, now descending into the barge, and finding nothing suspicious, reports it clean, having put his finger into the open bung of the keg, and tasted that the water was pure. The barge is ordered out to the booms, and deep night is waited for, ere the coxswain essays to snatch the bottles from the keg. But, unfortunately for the success of this masterly smuggler, one of his crew is a weak-pated fellow, who, having drank somewhat freely ashore, goes about the gun-deck throwing out profound, tipsy hints concerning some unutterable proceeding on the ship's anvil. A knowing old sheet-anchorman, an unprincipled fellow, putting this, that, and the other together, ferrets out the mystery, and straightway resolves to reap the goodly harvest which the coxswain has sowed. He seeks him out, takes him to one side, and addresses him thus: "Coxswain, you have been smuggling off some red-eye, which at this moment is in your barge at the booms. Now, coxswain, I have stationed 2 of my messmates at the portholes on that side of the ship, and if they report to me that you or any of your bargemen offer to enter that barge before morning, I will immediately report you as a smuggler to the officer of the deck." The coxswain is astounded, for to be reported to the deck officer as a smuggler would inevitably procure him a sound flogging, and be the disgraceful breaking of him as a petty officer, receiving $4 a month beyond his pay as an able seaman. He attempts to bribe the other to secrecy by promising half the profits of the enterprise. But the sheet-anchorman's integrity is like a rock. He is no mercenary, to be bought up for a song. The coxswain, therefore, is forced to swear that neither himself nor any of his crew shall enter the barge before morning. This done, the sheet-anchorman goes to his confidants and arranges his plans. In a word, he succeeds in introducing the 6 brandy bottles into the ship, 5 of which he sells at $8 a bottle, and then, with the 6th, between 2 guns, he secretly regales himself and confederates, while the helpless coxswain, stifling his rage, bitterly eyes them from afar. Thus, though they say that there is honor among thieves, there is little among man-of-war smugglers. End of Chapter 43. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 44 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 44. A Knave in Office in a Man of War. The last smuggling story now about to be related also occurred while we lay in Rio. It is the more particularly presented, since it furnishes the most curious evidence of the almost incredible corruption pervading nearly all ranks in some men of war. For some days, the number of intoxicated sailors collared and brought up to the mast by the master-at-arms, to be reported to the deck officers previous to a flogging at the gangway, had, in the last degree, excited the surprise and vexation of the captain and senior officers. So strict were the captain's regulations concerning the suppression of grog smuggling, and so particular had he been in charging the matter upon all the lieutenants and every understrapper official in the frigate, that he was wholly at a loss how so large a quantity of spirits could have been spirited into the ship, in the face of all these checks, guards, and precautions. Still, additional steps were adopted to detect the smugglers, and Bland, the master-at-arms, together with his corporals, were publicly harangued at the mast by the captain in person, and charged to exert their best powers in suppressing the traffic. Crowds were present at the time, and saw the master-at-arms touch his cap in obsequious homage as he solemnly assured the captain that he would still continue to do his best, as indeed he said he had always done. He concluded with a pious ejaculation expressive of his personal abhorrence of smuggling and drunkenness, and his fixed resolution, so help him heaven, to spend his last wink in sitting up by night to spy out all deeds of darkness. "I do not doubt you, master-at-arms," returned the captain. "Now go to your duty." This master-at-arms was a favorite of the captain's. The next morning, before breakfast, when the market boat came off, that is, one of the ship's boats regularly deputed to bring off the daily fresh provisions for the officers. When this boat came off, the master-at-arms, as usual, after carefully examining both her and her crew, reported them to the deck officer to be free from suspicion. The provisions were then hoisted out, and among them came a good-sized wooden box addressed to Mr. Purser of the United States ship Neversink. Of course, any private matter of this sort, destined for a gentleman of the ward-room, was sacred from examination, and the master-at-arms commanded one of his corporals to carry it down into the purser's state-room. But recent occurrences had sharpened the vigilance of the deck officer to an unwonted degree, and seeing the box going down the hatchway, he demanded what that was, and whom it was for. "All right, sir," said the master-at-arms, touching his cap. "Stores for the purser, sir." "Let it remain on deck," said the lieutenant. "Mr. Montgomery," calling a midshipman, "ask the purser whether there is any box coming off for him this morning." "Aye, aye, sir," said the middy, touching his cap. Presently he returned, saying that the purser was ashore. "Very good, then, Mr. Montgomery. Have that box put into the brig, with strict orders to the sentry not to suffer any one to touch it." "Had I not better take it down into my mess, sir, till the purser comes off?" said the master-at-arms, deferentially. "I have given my orders, sir," said the lieutenant, turning away. When the purser came on board, it turned out that he knew nothing at all about the box. He had never so much as heard of it in his life. So it was again brought up before the deck officer, who immediately summoned the master-at-arms. "Break open that box." "Certainly, sir," said the master-at-arms, and, wrenching off the cover, 25 brown jugs, like a litter of 25 brown pigs, were found snugly nestled in a bed of straw. "The smugglers are at work, sir," said the master-at-arms, looking up. "Uncork and taste it," said the officer. The master-at-arms did so, and, smacking his lips after a puzzled fashion, was a little doubtful whether it was American whiskey or Holland gin, but he said he was not used to liquor. "Brandy, I know it by the smell," said the officer. "Return the box to the brig." "Aye, aye, sir," said the master-at-arms, redoubling his activity. The affair was at once reported to the captain, who, incensed at the audacity of the thing, adopted every plan to detect the guilty parties. Inquiries were made ashore, but by whom the box had been brought down to the market boat there was no finding out. Here the matter rested for a time. Some days after, one of the boys of the mizzen-top was flogged for drunkenness, and, while suspended in agony at the gratings, was made to reveal from whom he had procured his spirits. The man was called, and turned out to be an old superannuated marine, one Scriggs, who did the cooking for the marine sergeants and masters-at-arms mess. This marine was one of the most villainous-looking fellows in the ship, with a squinting, picklock gray eye, and hang-dog gallows gait. How such a most unmartial vagabond had insinuated himself into the honorable Marine Corps was a perfect mystery. He had always been noted for his personal uncleanliness, and among all hands, fore and aft, had the reputation of being a notorious old miser, who denied himself the few comforts and many of the common necessaries of a man-of-war life. Seeing no escape, Scriggs fell on his knees before the captain, and confessed the charge of the boy. Observing the fellow to be in an agony of fear at the sight of the boatswain's mates and their lashes, and all the striking parade of public punishment, the captain must have thought this a good opportunity for completely pumping him of all his secrets. This terrified marine was at length forced to reveal his having been for some time an accomplice in a complicated system of underhand villainy, the head of which was no less a personage than the indefatigable chief of police, the master-at-arms himself. It appeared that this official had his confidential agents ashore, who supplied him with spirits, and in various boxes, packages, and bundles, addressed to the purser and others, brought them down to the frigate's boats at the landing. Ordinarily, the appearance of these things for the purser and other ward-room gentlemen occasioned no surprise, for almost every day some bundle or other is coming off for them, especially for the purser, and as the master-at-arms was always present on these occasions, it was an easy matter for him to hurry the smuggled liquor out of sight, and, under pretence of carrying the box or bundle down to the purser's room, hide it away upon his own premises. The miserly marine Scriggs, with the picklock eye, was the man who clandestinely sold the spirits to the sailors, thus completely keeping the master-at-arms in the background. The liquor sold at the most exorbitant prices, at one time reaching $12 the bottle in cash, and $30 a bottle in orders upon the purser, to be honored upon the frigate's arrival home. It may seem incredible that such prices should have been given by the sailors, but when some men-of-war's men crave liquor, and it is hard to procure, they would almost barter 10 years of their lifetime for but one solitary tot, if they could. The sailors who became intoxicated with the liquor thus smuggled on board by the master-at-arms were, in almost numberless instances, officially seized by that functionary and scourged at the gangway. In a previous place it has been shown how conspicuous a part the master-at-arms enacts at this scene. The ample profits of this iniquitous business were divided between all the parties concerned in it, Scriggs, the marine, coming in for 1/3. His cook's mess chest being brought on deck, 4 canvas bags of silver were found in it, amounting to a sum something short of as many $100. The guilty parties were scourged, double-ironed, and for several weeks were confined in the brig under a sentry, all but the master-at-arms, who was merely cashiered and imprisoned for a time, with bracelets at his wrists. Upon being liberated, he was turned adrift among the ship's company, and, by way of disgracing him still more, was thrust into the waist, the most inglorious division of the ship. Upon going to dinner one day, I found him soberly seated at my own mess, and at first I could not but feel some very serious scruples about dining with him. Nevertheless, he was a man to study and digest. So, upon a little reflection, I was not displeased at his presence. It amazed me, however, that he had wormed himself into the mess, since so many of the other messes had declined the honor, until at last I ascertained that he had induced a messmate of ours, a distant relation of his, to prevail upon the cook to admit him. Now, it would not have answered for hardly any other mess in the ship to have received this man among them, for it would have torn a huge rent in their reputation. But our mess, A No. 1, the 42-pounder club, was composed of so fine a set of fellows, so many captains of tops and quartermasters, men of undeniable mark on board ship, of long established standing and consideration on the gun-deck, that, with impunity, we could do so many equivocal things, utterly inadmissible for the messes of inferior pretension. Besides, though we all abhorred the monster of sin itself, yet, from our social superiority, highly rarefied education in our lofty top, and large and liberal sweep of the aggregate of things, we were, in a good degree, free from those useless personal prejudices and galling hatreds against conspicuous sinners, not sin, which so widely prevail among men of warped understandings and unchristian and uncharitable hearts. No, the superstitions and dogmas concerning sin had not laid their withering maxims upon our hearts. We perceived how that evil was but good disguised, and a knave a saint in his way, how that in other planets, perhaps, what we deem wrong may there be deemed right, even as some substances, without undergoing any mutations in themselves, utterly change their color according to the light thrown upon them. We perceived that the anticipated millennium must have begun upon the morning the first words were created, and that, taken all in all, our man-of-war world itself was as eligible a round-sterned craft as any to be found in the Milky Way. And we fancied that though some of us, of the gun-deck, were at times condemned to sufferings and blights and all manner of tribulation and anguish, yet no doubt it was only our misapprehension of these things that made us take them for woeful pains instead of the most agreeable pleasures. I have dreamed of a sphere, says Penzella, where to break a man on the wheel is held the most exquisite of delights you can confer upon him, where for one gentleman in any way to vanquish another is accounted an everlasting dishonor, where to tumble one into a pit after death, and then throw cold clods upon his upturned face, is a species of contumely only inflicted upon the most notorious criminals. But whatever we messmates thought, in whatever circumstances we found ourselves, we never forgot that our frigate had, as it was homeward bound. Such, at least, were our reveries at times, though sorely jarred, now and then, by events that took our philosophy aback. For after all, philosophy, that is, the best wisdom that has ever in any way been revealed to our man-of-war world, is but a slough and a mire, with a few tufts of good footing here and there. But there was one man in the mess who would have naught to do with our philosophy, a churlish, ill-tempered, unphilosophical, superstitious old bear of a quarter-gunner, a believer in Tophet, for which he was accordingly preparing himself. Priming was his name, but methinks I have spoken of him before. Besides, this Bland, the master-at-arms, was no vulgar, dirty knave. In him, to modify Burke's phrase, vice seemed, but only seemed, to lose half its seeming evil by losing all its apparent grossness. He was a neat and gentlemanly villain, and broke his biscuit with a dainty hand. There was a fine polish about his whole person, and a pliant, insinuating style in his conversation that was, socially, quite irresistible. Save my noble captain, Jack Chase, he proved himself the most entertaining, I had almost said the most companionable man in the mess. Nothing but his mouth, that was somewhat small, Moorish-arched, and wickedly delicate, and his snaky black eye, that at times shone like a dark lantern in a jeweller's shop at midnight, betokened the accomplished scoundrel within. But in his conversation there was no trace of evil, nothing equivocal. He studiously shunned an indelicacy, never swore, and chiefly abounded in passing puns and witticisms, varied with humorous contrasts between ship and shore life, and many agreeable and racy anecdotes, very tastefully narrated. In short, in a merely psychological point of view, at least, he was a charming blackleg. Ashore, such a man might have been an irreproachable mercantile swindler, circulating in polite society. But he was still more than this. Indeed, I claim for this master-at-arms a lofty and honorable niche in the Newgate calendar of history. His intrepidity, coolness, and wonderful self-possession in calmly resigning himself to a fate that thrust him from an office in which he had tyrannized over 500 mortals, many of whom hated and loathed him, past all belief. His intrepidity, I say, in now fearlessly gliding among them, like a disarmed swordfish among ferocious white sharks, this surely bespoke no ordinary man. While in office, even his life had often been secretly attempted by the seamen whom he had brought to the gangway. Of dark nights they had dropped shot down the hatchways, destined to damage his pepper-box, as they phrased it. They had made ropes with a hangman's noose at the end, and tried to lasso him in dark corners. And now he was adrift among them, under notorious circumstances of superlative villainy, at last dragged to light, and yet he blandly smiled, politely offered his cigar-holder to a perfect stranger, and laughed and chatted to right and left, as if springy, buoyant, and elastic, with an angelic conscience, and sure of kind friends wherever he went, both in this life and the life to come. While he was lying ironed in the brig, gangs of the men were sometimes overheard whispering about the terrible reception they would give him when he should be set at large. Nevertheless, when liberated, they seemed confounded by his erect and cordial assurance, his gentlemanly sociability, and fearless companionableness. From being an implacable policeman, vigilant, cruel, and remorseless in his office, however polished in his phrases, he was now become a disinterested, sauntering man of leisure, winking at all improprieties, and ready to laugh and make merry with anyone. Still, at first, the men gave him a wide berth, and returned scowls for his smiles. But who can forever resist the very devil himself, when he comes in the guise of a gentleman, free, fine, and frank? Though Goethe's pious Margaret hates the devil in his horns and harpooner's tail, yet she smiles and nods to the engaging fiend in the persuasive, winning, oily, wholly harmless Mephistopheles. But however it was, I, for one, regarded this master-at-arms with mixed feelings of detestation, pity, admiration, and something opposed to enmity. I could not but abominate him when I thought of his conduct, but I pitied the continual gnawing which, under all his deftly donned disguises, I saw lying at the bottom of his soul. I admired his heroism in sustaining himself so well under such reverses, and when I thought how arbitrary the articles of war are in defining a man-of-war villain, how much undetected guilt might be sheltered by the aristocratic awning of our quarter-deck, how many florid pursers, ornaments of the wardroom, had been legally protected in defrauding the people, I could not but say to myself, well, after all, though this man is a most wicked one indeed, yet is he even more luckless than depraved. Besides, A studied observation of Bland convinced me that he was an organic and irreclaimable scoundrel who did wicked deeds as the cattle browsed the herbage, because wicked deeds seemed the legitimate operation of his whole infernal organization. Phrenologically, he was without a soul. Is it to be wondered at that the devils are irreligious? What then, thought I, who is to blame in this matter? For one, I will not take the day of judgment upon me by authoritatively pronouncing upon the essential criminality of any man-of-war's man. And Christianity has taught me that at the last day man-of-war's men will not be judged by the Articles of War, nor by the United States statutes at large, but by immutable laws, ineffably beyond the comprehension of the Honorable Board of Commodores and Navy Commissioners. But though I will stand by even a man-of-war thief, and defend him from being seized up at the gangway, if I can, remembering that my Saviour once hung between two thieves, promising one life eternal, yet I would not, after the plain conviction of a villain, again let him entirely loose to prey upon honest seamen, fore and aft all 3 decks. But this did Captain Claret, and though the thing may not perhaps be credited, nevertheless, here it shall be recorded. After the master-at-arms had been adrift among the ship's company for several weeks, and we were within a few days' sail of home, he was summoned to the mast, and publicly reinstated in his office as the ship's chief of police. Perhaps Captain Claret had read the memoirs of Vidocq, and believed in the old saying, "Set a rogue to catch a rogue." Or perhaps he was a man of very tender feelings, highly susceptible to the soft emotions of gratitude, and could not bear to leave in disgrace a person who, out of the generosity of his heart, had, about a year previous, presented him with a rare snuff-box, fabricated from a sperm-whale's tooth, with a curious silver hinge, and cunningly wrought in the shape of a whale. Also, a splendid gold-mounted cane of a costly Brazilian wood, with a gold plate bearing the captain's name and rank in the service, the place and time of his birth, and with a vacancy underneath, no doubt providentially left for his heirs to record his decease. Certain it was that, some months previous to the master-at-arms' disgrace, he had presented these articles to the captain with his best love and compliments, and the captain had received them, and seldom went ashore without the cane, and never took snuff but out of that box. With some captains, a sense of propriety might have induced them to return these presents, when the generous donor had proved himself unworthy of having them retained. But it was not Captain Claret who would inflict such a cutting wound upon any officer's sensibilities, though long-established naval customs had habituated him to scourging the people upon an emergency. Now, had Captain Claret deemed himself constitutionally bound to decline all presents from his subordinates, the sense of gratitude would not have operated to the prejudice of justice, and as some of the subordinates of a man-of-war captain are apt to invoke his good wishes and mollify his conscience by making him friendly gifts, it would perhaps have been an excellent thing for him to adopt the plan pursued by the President of the United States, when he received a present of lions and Arabian chargers from the Sultan of Muscat. Being forbidden by his sovereign lords and masters, the imperial people, to accept of any gifts from foreign powers, the President sent them to an auctioneer, and the proceeds were deposited in the treasury. In the same manner, when Captain Claret received his snuff-box and cane, he might have accepted them very kindly, and then sold them off to the highest bidder, perhaps to the donor himself, who in that case would never have tempted him again. Upon his return home, Bland was paid off for his full term, not deducting the period of his suspension. He again entered the service in his old capacity. As no further allusion will be made to this affair, It may as well be stated now that for the very brief period elapsing between his restoration and being paid off in port by the purser, the master-at-arms conducted himself with infinite discretion, artfully steering between any relaxation of discipline which would have awakened the displeasure of the officers, and any unwise severity which would have revived in tenfold force all the old grudges of the seamen under his command. Never did he show so much talent and tact as when vibrating in this his most delicate predicament, and plenty of cause was there for the exercise of his cunningest abilities. For upon the discharge of our man-of-war's men at home, should he then be held by them as an enemy, as free and independent citizens, they would waylay him in the public streets, and take purple vengeance for all his iniquities, past, present, and possible in the future. More than once a master-at-arms ashore has been seized by night by an exasperated crew, and served as Origen served himself, or as his enemies served Abelard. But though, under extreme provocation, the people of a man-of-war have been guilty of the maddest vengeance, yet at other times they are very placable and milky-hearted, even to those who may have outrageously abused them. Many things in point might be related, but I forbear. This account of the master-at-arms cannot better be concluded than by denominating him, in the vivid language of the captain of the foretop, as the two ends and middle of the thrice-laid strand of a bloody rascal, which was intended for a terse, well-knit, and all-comprehensive assertion without omission or reservation. It was also asserted that, had Tophet itself been raked with a fine-tooth comb, such another ineffable villain could not by any possibility have been caught. End of Chapter 44. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 45 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 45. Publishing Poetry in a Man of War. A day or two after our arrival in Rio, a rather amusing incident occurred to a particular acquaintance of mine, young Lemsford, the gun-deck bard. The great guns of an armed ship have blocks of wood, called tompions, painted black, inserted in their muzzles to keep out the spray of the sea. These tompions slip in and out very handily, like covers to butter firkins. By advice of a friend, Lemsford, alarmed for the fate of his box of poetry, had latterly made use of a particular gun on the main deck, in the tube of which he thrust his manuscripts by simply crawling partly out of the port-hole, removing the tompion, inserting his papers, tightly rolled, and making all snug again. Breakfast over, he and I were reclining in the main-top, where, by permission of my noble master, Jack Chase, I had invited him, when, of a sudden, we heard a cannonading. It was our own ship. "Ah," said a topman, "returning the shore salute they gave us yesterday." "Oh, Lord!" cried Lemsford, "my songs of the sirens!" And he ran down the rigging to the batteries, but just as he touched the gun-deck, gun number 20, his literary strong-box went off with a terrific report. "Well, my after-guard Virgil," said Jack Chase to him as he slowly returned up the rigging, "did you get it?" "You need not answer. I see you were too late. But never mind, my boy, no printer could do the business for you better. That's the way to publish, White Jacket," turning to me. "Fire it right into 'em, every canto a 24-pound shot. Hull the blockheads whether they will or no. And mind you, Lemsford, when your shot does the most execution, you hear the least from the foe. A killed man cannot even lisp. "Glorious Jack!" cried Lemsford, running up and snatching him by the hand. "Say that again, Jack. Look me in the eyes. By all the homers, Jack, you have made my soul mount like a balloon. Jack, I'm a poor devil of a poet. Not 2 months before I shipped aboard here, I published a volume of poems, very aggressive on the world, Jack. Heaven knows what it cost me. I published it, Jack, and the cursed publisher sued me for damages. My friends looked sheepish. 1 or 2 who liked it were non-committal. And as for the addle-pated mob and rabble, they thought they had found out a fool. Blast them, Jack. What they call the public is a monster, like the idol we saw in Owyhee, with the head of a jackass, the body of a baboon, and the tail of a scorpion." "I don't like that," said Jack. "When I'm ashore, I myself am part of the public." "Your pardon, Jack, you are not. You are then a part of the people, just as you are aboard the frigate here. The public is one thing, Jack, and the people another." "You are right," said Jack. "Right as this leg. Virgil, you are a trump. You are a jewel, my boy. The public and the people. Aye, aye, my lads, let us hate the one and cleave to the other." End of Chapter 45. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 46 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 46. The Commodore on the poop, and one of the people under the hands of the surgeon. A day or 2 after the publication of Lemsford's Songs of the Sirens, a sad accident befell a messmate of mine, one of the captains of the mizzen-top. He was a fine little Scot, who, from the premature loss of the hair on the top of his head, always went by the name of Baldy. This baldness was no doubt, in great part, attributable to the same cause that early thins the locks of most man-of-war's men, namely, the hard, unyielding, and ponderous man-of-war and navy regulation tarpaulin hat, which, when new, is stiff enough to sit upon, and indeed, in lieu of his thumb, sometimes serves the common sailor for a bench. Now, there is nothing upon which the Commodore of a squadron more prides himself than upon the celerity with which his men can handle the sails, and go through with all the evolutions pertaining thereto. This is especially manifested in harbor, when other vessels of his squadron are near, and perhaps the armed ships of rival nations. Upon these occasions, surrounded by his post-captain satraps, each of whom in his own floating island is king, the Commodore domineers over all, emperor of the whole oaken archipelago, yea, magisterial and magnificent as the Sultan of the Isles of Sulu. But, even as so potent an emperor and Caesar to boot, as the great Don of Germany, Charles V, was used to divert himself in his dotage by watching the gyrations of the springs and cogs of a long row of clocks, even so does an elderly Commodore while away his leisure in harbor, by what is called exercising guns, and also exercising yards and sails, causing the various spars of all the ships under his command to be braced, topped, and cock-billed in concert, while the Commodore himself sits something like King Canute on an arm-chest on the poop of his flagship. But far more regal than any descendant of Charlemagne, more haughty than any Mogul of the East, and almost mysterious and voiceless in his authority as the Great Spirit of the Five Nations, the Commodore deigns not to verbalize his commands, They are imparted by signal. And as for old Charles V again, the gay pranked colored suits of cards were invented, to while away his dotage. Even so, doubtless, must these pretty little signals of blue and red spotted bunting have been devised to cheer the old age of all Commodores. By the Commodore's side stands the signal midshipman, with a sea-green bag swung on his shoulder, as a sportsman wears his game bag, the signal book in one hand, and the signal spy-glass in the other. As this signal book contains the Masonic signs and tokens of the Navy, and would therefore be invaluable to an enemy, its binding is always bordered with lead, so as to ensure its sinking in case the ship should be captured. Not the only book this, that might appropriately be bound in lead, though there be many where the author, and not the bookbinder, furnishes the metal. As White Jacket understands it, these signals consist of variously colored flags, each standing for a certain number. Say there are 10 flags, representing the cardinal numbers, the red flag number 1, the blue flag number 2, the green flag number 3, and so forth. Then, by mounting the blue flag over the red, that would stand for number 21. If the green flag were set underneath, it would then stand for 213. How easy, then, by endless transpositions, to multiply the various numbers that may be exhibited at the mizzen-peak, even by only 3 or 4 of these flags. To each number a particular meaning is applied. Number 100, for instance, may mean beat to quarters. Number 150, all hands to grog. Number 2000, strike top-gallant yards. Number 2110, see anything to windward. Number 2800, no. And as every man-of-war is furnished with a signal book, where all these things are set down in order, therefore, though 2 American frigates, almost perfect strangers to each other, came from the opposite poles, yet at a distance of more than a mile they could carry on a very liberal conversation in the air. When several men of war of one nation lie at anchor in one port, forming a wide circle round their lord and master, the flagship, it is a very interesting sight to see them all obeying the Commodore's orders, who meanwhile never opens his lips. Thus was it with us in Rio, and hereby hangs the story of my poor messmate Bally. One morning, in obedience to a signal from our flagship, the various vessels belonging to the American squadron then in harbor simultaneously loosened their sails to dry. In the evening, the signal was set to furl them. Upon such occasions, great rivalry exists between the first lieutenants of the different ships. They vie with each other, who shall first have his sails stowed on the yards. And this rivalry is shared between all the officers of each vessel, who are respectively placed over the different topmen, so that the main-mast is all eagerness to vanquish the foremast, and the mizzen-mast to vanquish them both. Stimulated by the shouts of their officers, the sailors throughout the squadron exert themselves to the utmost. "Aloft, topmen! Lay out! Furl!" cried the first lieutenant of the Neversink. At the word, the men sprang into the rigging, and on all 3 masts were soon climbing about the yards, in reckless haste to execute their orders. Now, in furling topsails or courses, the point of honor, and the hardest work, is in the bunt, or middle of the yard. This post belongs to the first captain of the top. "What are you about there, mizzen-topmen?" roared the first lieutenant through his trumpet. "Blank you, you are clumsy as Russian bears. Don't you see the main topmen are nearly off the yard? Bear a hand! Bear a hand, or I'll stop your grog all round. You, Baldy, are you going to sleep there in the bunt?" While this was being said, Poor Baldy, his hat off, his face streaming with perspiration, was frantically exerting himself, piling up the ponderous folds of canvas in the middle of the yard, ever and anon glancing at victorious Jack Chase, hard at work at the main topsail yard before him. At last, the sail being well piled up, Baldy jumped with both feet into the bunt, holding on with one hand to the chain tie, and in that manner was violently treading down the canvas to pack it close. "Blank you, Baldy, why don't you move, you crawling caterpillar?" roared the First Lieutenant. Baldy brought his whole weight to bear on the rebellious sail, and in his frenzied heedlessness let go his hold on the tie. "You, Baldy, are you afraid of falling?" cried the First Lieutenant. At that moment, with all his force, Baldy jumped down upon the sail, the bunt gasket parted, and a dark form dropped through the air. Lighting upon the top rim, it rolled off, and the next instant, with a horrid crash of all his bones, Baldy came, like a thunderbolt, upon the deck. Aboard of most large men of war, there is a stout oaken platform, about 4 feet square, on each side of the quarter-deck. You ascend to it by 3 or 4 steps. On top it is railed in at the sides, with horizontal brass bars. It is called the horse-block, and there the officer of the deck usually stands, in giving his orders at sea. It was one of these horse-blocks, now unoccupied, that broke poor Baldy's fall. He fell lengthwise across the brass bars, bending them into elbows, and crushing the whole oaken platform, steps and all, right down to the deck in 1,000 splinters. He was picked up for dead, and carried below to the surgeon. His bones seemed like those of a man broken on the wheel, and no one thought he would survive the night. But with the surgeon's skillful treatment, he soon promised recovery. Surgeon Cuticle devoted all his science to this case. A curious framework of wood was made for the maimed man, and placed in this, with all his limbs stretched out, Baldy lay flat on the floor of the sick-bay for many weeks. Upon our arrival home, he was able to hobble ashore on crutches, but from a hale, hearty man, with bronzed cheeks, he was become a mere dislocated skeleton, white as foam. But ere this, perhaps, his broken bones are healed and whole in the last repose of the man-of-war's man. Not many days after Baldy's accident in furling sails, in this same frenzied manner, under the stimulus of a shouting officer, a seaman fell from the main royal yard of an English line of battleship near us, and buried his ankle bones in the deck, leaving 2 indentations there, as if scooped out by a carpenter's gouge. The royal yard forms a cross with the mast, and falling from that lofty cross in a line of battleship is almost like falling from the cross of St. Paul's, almost like falling as Lucifer from the wellspring of morning down to the phlegethon of night. In some cases, a man hurled thus from a yard has fallen upon his own shipmates in the tops, and dragged them down with him to the same destruction with himself. Hardly ever will you hear of a man-of-war returning home after a cruise without the loss of some of her crew from aloft, whereas similar accidents in the merchant service, considering the much greater number of men employed in it, are comparatively few. Why mince the matter? The death of most of these man-of-war's men lies at the door of the souls of those officers who, while safely standing on deck themselves, scruple not to sacrifice an immortal man or 2 in order to show off the excelling discipline of the ship. And thus do the people of the gun-deck suffer, that the Commodore on the poop may be glorified. End of chapter 46. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 47 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 47. An Auction in a Man of War. Some allusion has been made to the weariness experienced by the man-of-war's men while lying at anchor, but there are scenes now and then that serve to relieve it. Chief among these are the purser's auctions, taking place while in harbor. Some weeks, or perhaps months, after a sailor dies in an armed vessel, his bag of clothes is in this manner sold, and the proceeds transferred to the account of his heirs or executors. One of these auctions came off in Rio, shortly after the sad accident of Baldy. It was a dreamy, quiet afternoon, and the crew were listlessly lying around, when suddenly the boatswain's whistle was heard, followed by the announcement, "D'ye hear there, fore and aft? Purser's auction, on the spar deck." At the sound, the sailors sprang to their feet and mustered round the mainmast. Presently up came the purser's steward, marshalling before him 3 or 4 of his subordinates, carrying several clothes bags, which were deposited at the base of the mast. Our purser's steward was a rather gentlemanly man in his way. Like many young Americans of his class, he had at various times assumed the most opposite functions for a livelihood, turning from one to the other with all the facility of a light-hearted, clever adventurer. He had been a clerk in a steamer on the Mississippi River, an auctioneer in Ohio, a stock actor at the Olympic Theatre in New York, and now he was purser's steward in the Navy. In the course of this diversified career, his natural wit and waggery had been highly spiced, and every way improved, and he had acquired the last and most difficult art of the joker, the art of lengthening his own face while widening those of his hearers, preserving the utmost solemnity while setting them all in a roar. He was quite a favorite with the sailors, which, in a good degree, was owing to his humor, but likewise to his offhand, irresistible, romantic, theatrical manner of addressing them. With a dignified air, he now mounted the pedestal of the main-top-sail sheet-bitts, imposing silence by a theatrical wave of his hand. Meantime, his subordinates were rummaging the bags and assorting their contents before him. "Now, my noble hearties," he began, "we will open this auction by offering to your impartial competition a very superior pair of old boots." And so saying, he dangled aloft one clumsy cowhide cylinder, almost as large as a fire-bucket, as a specimen of the complete pair. "What shall I have now, my noble tars, for this superior pair of sea-boots?" "Where's the other boot?" cried a suspicious-eyed waster. "I remember them 'ere boots. They were old Bob's, the quarter-gunner's. There was 2 on 'em, too. I want to see the other boot." "My sweet and pleasant fellow," said the auctioneer, with his blandest accents, "the other boot is not just at hand, but I give you my word of honor that it in all respects corresponds to the one you here see. It does, I assure you. And I solemnly guarantee, my noble seafaring fencibles," he added, turning round upon all, "that the other boot is the exact counterpart of this. Now then, say the word, my fine fellows. What shall I have? $10, did you say?" politely bowing toward some indefinite person in the background. "No, 10 cents," responded a voice. 10 cents, 10 cents, gallant sailors, for this noble pair of boots!" exclaimed the auctioneer, with affected horror. "I must close the auction, my tars of Columbia. This will never do. But let's have another bid now. Come," he added, coaxingly and soothingly. "What is it? $1? $1 then. $1. Going at $1. Going. Just see how it vibrates," swinging the boot to and fro. "This superior pair of sea boots vibrating at $1. Wouldn't pay for the nails in their heels. Going, gone." And down went the boots. "Ah, what a sacrifice! What a sacrifice!" he sighed, tearfully eyeing the solitary fire bucket, and then glancing round the company for sympathy. "A sacrifice indeed!" exclaimed Jack Chase, who stood by. "Purser's steward, you are Mark Antony over the body of Julius Caesar." So I am," said the auctioneer, without moving a muscle. "And look," he exclaimed, suddenly seizing the boot, and exhibiting it on high. "Look, my noble tars, if you have tears, prepare to shed them now. You all do know this boot. I remember the first time ever old Bob put it on. 'Twas on a winter evening, off Cape Horn, between the starboard carronades. That day his precious grog was stopped. Look, in this place a mouse has nibbled through. See what a rent some envious rat has made. Through this another filed, and, as he plucked his cursed rasp away, mark how the boot leg gaped. This was the unkindest cut of all. But whose are the boots?" suddenly assuming a business-like air. "Yours? Yours? Yours?" But not a friend of the lamented Bob stood by. "Tars of Columbia," said the auctioneer, imperatively, "these boots must be sold, and if I can't sell them one way, I must sell them another. How much a pound, now, for this superior pair of old boots? Going by the pound, now, remember, my gallant sailors. What shall I have? 1 cent, do I hear? Going now at 1 cent a pound. Going, gone. Whose are they? Yours, Captain of the Waist? Well, my sweet and pleasant friends, I will have them weighed out to you when the auction is over." In like manner, all the contents of the bags were disposed of, embracing old frocks, trousers, and jackets, the various sums for which they went being charged to the bidders on the books of the purser. Having been present at this auction, though not a purchaser, and seeing with what facility the most dismantled old garments went off, through the magical cleverness of the accomplished auctioneer, the thought occurred to me, that if ever I calmly and positively decided to dispose of my famous white jacket, this would be the very way to do it. I turned the matter over in my mind a long time. The weather in Rio was genial and warm, and that I would ever again need such a thing as a heavy quilted jacket, and such a jacket as the white one, too, seemed almost impossible. Yet I remembered the American coast, and that it would probably be autumn when we should arrive there. Yes, I thought of all that, to be sure. Nevertheless, the ungovernable whim seized me to sacrifice my jacket and recklessly abide the consequences. Besides, was it not a horrible jacket? To how many annoyances had it subjected me? How many scrapes had it dragged me into? Nay, had it not once jeopardized my very existence? And I had a dreadful presentiment that, if I persisted in retaining it, it would do so again. "Enough, I will sell it," I muttered, and so muttering, I thrust my hands further down in my waistband, and walked the maintop in the stern concentration of an inflexible purpose. Next day, hearing that another auction was shortly to take place, I repaired to the office of the purser's steward, with whom I was upon rather friendly terms. After vaguely and delicately hinting at the object of my visit, I came roundly to the point, and asked him whether he could slip my jacket into one of the bags of clothes next to be sold, and so dispose of it by public auction. He kindly acquiesced, and the thing was done. In due time, all hands were again summoned round the main mast. The purser's steward mounted his post, and the ceremony began. Meanwhile, I lingered out of sight, but still within hearing, on the gun-deck below, gazing up, unperceived, at the scene. As it is now so long ago, I will here frankly make confession that I had privately retained the services of a friend, Williams, the Yankee pedagogue and peddler, whose business it would be to linger near the scene of the auction, and, if the bids on the jacket loitered, to start it roundly himself, and if the bidding then became brisk, he was continually to strike in with the most pertinacious and infatuated bids, and so exasperate competition into the maddest and most extravagant overtures. A variety of other articles having been put up, the white jacket was slowly produced, and, held high aloft between the auctioneer's thumb and forefinger, was submitted to the inspection of the discriminating public. Here it behooves me once again to describe my jacket, for as a portrait taken at one period of life will not answer for a later stage, much more this jacket of mine, undergoing so many changes, needs to be painted again and again, in order truly to present its actual appearance at any given period. A premature old age had now settled upon it. All over it bore melancholy sears of the masoned-up pockets that had once trenched it in various directions. Some parts of it were slightly mildewed from dampness. On one side several of the buttons were gone, and others were broken or cracked, while, alas, my many mad endeavors to rub it black on the decks had now imparted to the whole garment an exceedingly untidy appearance. Such as it was, with all its faults, the auctioneer displayed it. "You, venerable sheet-anchorman, and you, gallant fore-topman, and you, my fine waisters, what do you say now for this superior old jacket? Buttons and sleeves, lining and skirts, it must this day be sold without reservation. How much for it, my gallant tars of Columbia? Say the word, and how much?" "My eyes!" exclaimed a fore-topman. "Don't that 'ere bunch of old swabs belong to Jack Chase's pet? Aren't that the white jacket?" "The white jacket!" cried 50 voices in response. "The white jacket!" The cry ran fore and aft the ship like a slogan, completely overwhelming the solitary voice of my private friend Williams, while all hands gazed at it with straining eyes, wondering how it came among the bags of deceased mariners. "Ay, noble tars," said the auctioneer, "you may well stare at it. You will not find another jacket like this on either side of Cape Horn, I assure you. Why, just look at it. How much, now? Give me a bid. But don't be rash, be prudent. Be prudent, men, remember your purse's accounts, and don't be betrayed into extravagant bids." "Purser's steward," cried Grummet, one of the quarter-gunners, slowly shifting his quid from one cheek to the other like a ballast stone, "I won't bid on that 'ere bunch of old swabs, unless you put up 10 pounds of soap with it." "Don't mind that old fellow," said the auctioneer. "How much for the jacket, my noble tars?" "Jacket?" cried a dandy bone-polisher of the gun-room. "The sailmaker was the tailor then. How many fathoms of canvas in it, purser's steward?" "How much for this jacket?" reiterated the auctioneer emphatically. "Jacket, do you call it?" cried a captain of the hold. "Why not call it a whitewashed man-of-war schooner? Look at the portholes to let in the air of cold nights." "A regular herring net," chimed in Grummet. "Gives me the fever nager to look at it," echoed a mizzen-topman. "Silence!" cried the auctioneer. "Start it now. Start it, boys. Anything you please, my fine fellows. It must be sold. Come, what ought I to have on it now?" "Why, purser's steward," cried a waister, "you ought to have new sleeves, a new lining, and a new body on it, afore you try to shove it off on a greenhorn." "What are you bussing that 'ere garment for?" cried an old sheet-anchorman. "Don't you see it's a uniform mustering jacket, 3 buttons on one side and none on the other?" "Silence!" again cried the auctioneer. "How much, my sea fencibles, for this superior old jacket?" "Well," said Grummet, "I'll take it for cleaning rags at 1 cent." "Oh, come, give us a bid. Say something, Colombians." "Well, then," said Grummet, all at once bursting into genuine indignation, "if you want us to say something, then heave that bunch of old swabs overboard, say I, and show us something worth looking at." "No one will give me a bid, then? Very good. Here, shove it aside. Let's have something else there." While this scene was going forward, and my white jacket was thus being abused, how my heart swelled within me. Thrice was I on the point of rushing out of my hiding-place and bearing it off from derision. But I lingered, still flattering myself that all would be well, and the jacket find a purchaser at last. But no, alas, there was no getting rid of it, except by rolling a 42-pound shot in it, and committing it to the deep. But though, in my desperation, I had once contemplated something of that sort, yet I had now become unaccountably averse to it, from certain involuntary, superstitious considerations. If I sink my jacket, thought I, it will be sure to spread itself into a bed at the bottom of the sea, upon which I shall sooner or later recline, a dead man. So, unable to conjure it into the possession of another, and withheld from bearing it out of sight forever, my jacket stuck to me like the fatal shirt on Nessus. End of chapter 47. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 48 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 48. Purser, Purser's Steward, and Postmaster in a Man of War. As the purser's steward so conspicuously figured at the unsuccessful auction of my jacket, it reminds me of how important a personage that official is on board of all men of war. He is the right-hand man and confidential deputy and clerk of the purser, who entrusts to him all his accounts with the crew, while, in most cases, he himself, snug and comfortable in his stateroom, glances over a file of newspapers instead of overhauling his ledgers. Of all the non-combatants of a man of war, the purser, perhaps, stands foremost in importance. Though he is but a member of the gunroom mess, yet usage seems to assign him a conventional station somewhat above that of his equals in Navy rank, the chaplain, surgeon, and professor. Moreover, he is frequently to be seen in close conversation with the Commodore, who, in the Neversink, was more than once known to be slightly jocular with our purser. Upon several occasions, also, he was called into the Commodore's cabin, and remained closeted there for several minutes together. Nor do I remember that there ever happened a cabinet meeting of the wardroom barons, the lieutenants, in the Commodore's cabin, but the purser made one of the party. Doubtless the important fact of the purser having under his charge all the financial affairs of a man of war imparts to him the great importance he enjoys. Indeed, we find in every government, monarchies and republics alike, that the personage at the head of the finances invariably occupies a commanding position. Thus, in point of station, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States is deemed superior to the other heads of departments. Also, in England, the real office held by the great Premier himself is, as everyone knows, that of First Lord of the Treasury. Now, under this high functionary of state, the official known as the purser's steward was head clerk of the frigate's fiscal affairs. Upon the berth deck he had a regular counting-room, full of ledgers, journals, and day books. His desk was as much littered with papers as any Pearl Street merchant's, and much time was devoted to his accounts. For hours together you would see him, through the window of his subterranean office, writing by the light of his perpetual lamp. Ex officio, the purser's steward of most ships is a sort of postmaster, and his office the post office. When the letter bags for the squadron, almost as large as those of the United States mail, arrived on board the Neversink, it was the purser's steward that sat at his little window on the berth deck and handed you your letter or paper, if any there were to your address. Some disappointed applicants among the sailors would offer to buy the epistles of their more fortunate shipmates, while yet the seal was unbroken, maintaining that the sole and confidential reading of a fond, long domestic letter from any man's home was far better than no letter at all. In the vicinity of the office of the purser's steward are the principal storerooms of the purser, where large quantities of goods of every description are to be found. On board of those ships where goods are permitted to be served out to the crew for the purpose of selling them ashore to raise money, more business is transacted at the office of a purser's steward in one Liberty Day morning than all the dry goods shops in a considerable village would transact in a week. Once a month, with undeviating regularity, this official has his hands more than usually full. For once a month certain printed bills, called mess bills, are circulated among the crew, and whatever you may want from the purser, be it tobacco, soap, duck, dungaree, needles, thread, knives, belts, calico, ribbon, pipes, paper, pens, hats, inks, shoes, socks, or whatever it may be, down it goes on the mess bill, which, being the next day returned to the office of the steward, the slops, as they are called, are served out to the men and charged to their accounts. Lucky is it for man-of-war's men that the outrageous impositions to which, but a very few years ago, they were subjected from the abuses in this department of the service, and the unscrupulous cupidity of men of the pursers, lucky is it for them that now these things are in a great degree done away. The pursers, instead of being at liberty to make almost what they pleased from the sale of their wares, are now paid by regular stipends laid down by law. Under the exploded system, the profits of some of these officers were almost incredible. In one cruise up the Mediterranean, the purser of an American line of battleship was, on good authority, said to have cleared the sum of $50,000. Upon that he quitted the service, and retired into the country. Shortly after, his 3 daughters, not very lovely, married extremely well. The ideas that sailors entertain of pursers is expressed in a rather inelegant but expressive saying of theirs. The purser is a conjurer; he can make a dead man chew tobacco, insinuating that the accounts of a dead man are sometimes subjected to post-mortem charges. Among sailors, also, pursers commonly go by the name of nip-cheeses. No wonder that on board of the old frigate Java, upon her return from a cruise extending over a period of more than 4 years, $1,000 paid off 80 of her crew, though the aggregate wages of the 80 for the voyage must have amounted to about $60,000. Even under the present system, the purser of a line of battleship, for instance, is far better paid than any other officer, short of captain or commodore. While the lieutenant commonly receives but $1,800, the surgeon of the fleet but $1,500, the chaplain $1,200, the purser of a line of battleship receives $3,500. In considering his salary, however, his responsibilities are not to be overlooked. They are by no means insignificant. There are pursers in the Navy whom the sailors exempt from the insinuations above mentioned, nor, as a class, are they so obnoxious to them now as formerly. For one, the florid old purser of the Neversink, never coming into disciplinary contact with the seamen, and being withal a jovial and apparently good-hearted gentleman, was something of a favorite with many of the crew. End of Chapter 48. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 49 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 49. Rumors of a War, and how they were received by the population of the Neversink. While lying in the harbor of Callao in Peru, certain rumors had come to us touching a war with England, growing out of the long-vexed northeastern boundary question. In Rio, these rumors were increased, and the probability of hostilities induced our Commodore to authorize proceedings that closely brought home to every man on board the Neversink his liability at any time to be killed at his gun. Among other things, a number of men were detailed to pass up the rusty cannon balls from the shot lockers in the hold, and scrape them clean for service. The Commodore was a very neat gentleman, and would not fire a dirty shot into his foe. It was an interesting occasion for a tranquil observer, nor was it altogether neglected. Not to recite the precise remarks made by the seamen while pitching the shot up the hatchway from hand to hand, like schoolboys playing ball ashore, it will be enough to say that, from the general drift of their discourse, jocular as it was manifest that, almost to a man, they abhorred the idea of going into action. And why would they desire a war? Would their wages be raised? Not a cent. The prize money, though, ought to have been an inducement. But of all the rewards of virtue, prize money is the most uncertain, and this the man-of-war's man knows. What, then, has he to expect from war? What but harder work and harder usage than in peace? A wooden leg or arm, mortal wounds, and death? Enough, however, that by far the majority of the common sailors of the Neversink were plainly concerned at the prospect of war, and were plainly averse to it. But with the officers of the quarter-deck it was just the reverse. None of them, to be sure, in my hearing at least, verbally expressed their gratification, but it was unavoidably betrayed by the increased cheerfulness of their demeanor toward each other, their frequent fraternal conferences, and their unwonted animation for several days in issuing their orders. The voice of Mad Jack, always a belfry to hear, now resounded like that famous bell of England, Great Tom of Oxford. As for Selvagee, he wore his sword with a jaunty air, and his servant daily polished the blade. But why this contrast between the forecastle and the quarter-deck, between the man-of-war's man and his officer? Because, though war would equally jeopardize the lives of both, yet, while it held out to the sailor no promise of promotion, and what is called glory, these things fired the breast of his officers. It is no pleasing task, nor a thankful one, to dive into the souls of some men, but there are occasions when, to bring up the mud from the bottom, reveals to us on what soundings we are, on what coast we adjoin. How were these officers to gain glory? How but by a distinguished slaughtering of their fellow men? How were they to be promoted? How but over the buried heads of killed comrades and messmates? This hostile contrast between the feelings with which the common seamen and the officers of the Neversink looked forward to this more than possible war is one of many instances that might be quoted to show the antagonism of their interests, the incurable antagonism in which they dwell. But can men whose interests are diverse ever hope to live together in a harmony uncoerced? Can the brotherhood of the race of mankind ever hope to prevail in a man of war, where one man's bane is almost another's blessing? By abolishing the scourge shall we do away tyranny, that tyranny which must ever prevail, where of two essentially antagonistic classes in perpetual contact one is immeasurably the stronger? Surely it seems all but impossible. And as the very object of a man of war, as its name implies, is to fight the very battles so naturally averse to the seaman, so long as a man of war exists, it must ever remain a picture of much that is tyrannical and repelling in human nature. Being an establishment much more extensive than the American Navy, the English armed marine furnishes a yet more striking example of this thing, especially as the existence of war produces so vast an augmentation of her naval force compared with what it is in time of peace. It is well known what joy the news of Bonaparte's sudden return from Elba created among crowds of British naval officers, who had previously been expecting to be sent ashore on half-pay. Thus, when all the world wailed, these officers found occasion for thanksgiving. I urge it not against them as men; their feelings belonged to their profession. Had they not been naval officers, they had not been rejoicers in the midst of despair. When shall the time come? How much longer will God postpone it? When the clouds, which at times gather over the horizons of nations, shall not be hailed by any class of humanity, and invoked to burst as a bomb. Standing navies, as well as standing armies, serve to keep alive the spirit of war, even in the meek heart of peace. In its very embers and smolderings, they nourish that fatal fire, and half-pay officers, as the priests of Mars, yet guard the temple, though no God be there. End of chapter 49. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 50 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 50. The Bay of All Beauties. I have said that I must pass over Rio without a description, but just now such a flood of scented reminiscences steals over me, that I must needs yield and recant, as I inhale that musky air. More than 150 miles circuit of living green hills embosoms a translucent expanse, so gemmed in by sierras of grass that among the Indian tribes the place was known as the Hidden Water. On all sides, in the distance, rise high conical peaks, which at sunrise and sunset burn like vast tapers, and down from the interior, through vineyards and forests, flow radiating streams, all emptying into the harbor. Talk not of Bahia de Todos los Santos, the Bay of All Saints. For though that be a glorious haven, yet Rio is the Bay of all rivers, the Bay of all delights, the Bay of all beauties. From circumjacent hillsides, untiring summer hangs perpetually in terraces of vivid verdure, and, embossed with old mosses, convent and castle nestle in valley and glen. All around, deep inlets run into the green mountain land, and, overhung with wild highlands, more resemble Loch Katrines than Lake Lemans. And though Loch Katrine has been sung by the bonneted Scot, and Lake Leman by the coroneted Byron, yet here, in Rio, both the loch and the lake are but two wild flowers in a prospect that is almost unlimited. For behold, far away and away stretches the broad blue of the water to yonder soft-swelling hills of light green, backed by the purple pinnacles and pipes of the Grand Organ Mountains. Fitly so called, for in thunder time they roll cannonades down the bay, drowning the blended bass of all the cathedrals in Rio. Shout amain, Exalt your voices, stamp your feet, jubilate, Organ mountains, and roll your Te Deums round the world. What though, for more than 5,500 years, this grand harbor of Rio lay hid in the hills, unknown by the Catholic Portuguese? Centuries ere Haydn performed before emperors and kings, these Organ mountains played his oratorio of the creation, before the Creator himself. But nervous Haydn could not have endured that cannonading choir, since this composer of thunderbolts himself died at last through the crashing commotion of Napoleon's bombardment of Vienna. But all mountains are Organ mountains. The Alps and the Himalayas, the Appalachian chain, the Ural, the Andes, the Green Hills, and the White, all of them play anthems forever. The Messiah and Samson and Israel in Egypt, and Saul and Judas Maccabeus, and Solomon. Archipelago Rio. Ere Noah on old Ararat anchored his ark, there lay anchored in you all these green rocky isles I now see. But God did not build on you isles, those long lines of batteries, nor did our blessed Savior stand godfather at the christening of yon frowning fortress of Santa Cruz, though named in honor of himself, the divine Prince of Peace. Amphitheatrical Rio, in your broad expanse might be held the resurrection and judgment day of the whole world's men of war, represented by the flagships of fleets, the flagships of the Phoenician armed galleys of Tyre and Sidon, of King Solomon's annual squadrons that sailed to Ophir, whence in after times, perhaps, sailed the Acapulco fleets of the Spaniards, with golden ingots for ballasting, the flagships of all the Greek and Persian craft that exchanged the war-hug at Salamis, of all the Roman and Egyptian galleys that, eagle-like, with blood-dripping prows, beaked each other at Actium, of all the Danish keels of the Vikings, of all the mosquito craft of Abatuli, king of the Pelops, when he went to vanquish Artensal, of all the Venetian, Genoese, and Papal fleets that came to the shock at Lepanto, of both horns of the crescent of the Spanish Armada, of the Portuguese squadron that, under the gallant Gama, chastised the Moors and discovered the Moluccas, of all the Dutch navies read by Van Tromp and sunk by Admiral Hawke, of the 47 French and Spanish sail of the line that for 3 months essayed to batter down Gibraltar, of all Nelson's 74s that thunderbolted off St. Vincent's, at the Nile, Copenhagen, and Trafalgar, of all the frigate merchantmen of the East India Company, of Perry's war brigs, sloops, and schooners that scattered the British armament on Lake Erie, of all the Barbary corsairs captured by Bainbridge, of the war canoes of the Polynesian kings Tamahamaha and Pomare, aye, one and all, with Commodore Noah for their Lord High Admiral, in this abounding bay of Rio these flagships might all come to anchor, and swing round in concert to the first of the flood. Rio is a small Mediterranean, and what was fabled of the entrance to that sea in Rio is partly made true. For here, at the mouth, stands one of Hercules's pillars, the Sugarloaf Mountain, 1,000 feet high, inclining over a little, like the leaning tower of Pisa. At its base crouch, like mastiffs, the batteries of Jose and Theodosia, while opposite you are menaced by a rock-founded fort. The channel between, the sole inlet to the bay, seems but a biscuit's toss over. You see naught of the landlocked sea within, till fairly in the strait. But then, what a sight is beheld! Diversified as the harbor of Constantinople, but 1,000-fold grander. When the Neversink swept in, word was passed, "Aloft, top men, and furl t'gallant sails and royals!" At the sound I sprang into the rigging, and was soon at my perch. How I hung over that main royal yard in a rapture high in air, poised over that magnificent bay, a new world to my ravished eyes. I felt like the foremost of a flight of angels, new lighted upon earth, from some star in the Milky Way. End of Chapter 50. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 51 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 51. One of the people has an audience with the Commodore and the Captain on the quarterdeck. We had not lain in Rio long, when, in the innermost recesses of the mighty soul of my noble Captain of the Top, incomparable Jack Chase, the deliberate opinion was formed, and rock-founded, that our ship's company must have at least one day's liberty to go ashore ere we weighed anchor for home. Here it must be mentioned that, concerning anything of this kind, no sailor in a man of war ever presumes to be an agitator, unless he is of a rank superior to a mere able seaman, and no one short of a petty officer, that is, a captain of the top, a quarter-gunner, or boatswain's mate, ever dreams of being a spokesman to the supreme authority of the vessel in soliciting any kind of favor for himself and shipmates. After canvassing the matter thoroughly with several old quartermasters and other dignified sea fencibles, Jack, hat in hand, made his appearance one fine evening at the mast, and, waiting till Captain Claret drew nigh, bowed and addressed him in his own offhand, polished, and poetical style. In his intercourse with the quarterdeck, he always presumed upon his being such a universal favorite. "Sir, this Rio is a charming harbor, and we poor mariners, your trusty sea warriors, valiant Captain, who, with you at their head, would board the Rock of Gibraltar itself, and carry it by storm. We poor fellows, valiant Captain, have gazed round upon this ravishing landscape till we can gaze no more. Will Captain Claret vouchsafe one day's liberty, and so assure himself of eternal felicity, since in our flowing cups he will be ever after freshly remembered?" As Jack thus rounded off with a snatch from Shakespeare, he saluted the captain with a gallant flourish of his tarpaulin, and then, bringing the rim to his mouth, with his head bowed and his body thrown into a fine, negligent attitude, stood a picture of eloquent but passive appeal. He seemed to say, "Magnanimous Captain Claret, we fine fellows and hearts of oak throw ourselves upon your unparalleled goodness." "And what do you want to go ashore for?" asked the captain, evasively, and trying to conceal his admiration of Jack by affecting some haughtiness. Sir," sighed Jack, "why do the thirsty camels of the desert desire to lap the waters of the fountain and roll in the green grass of the oasis? Are we not but just from the ocean's Sahara? And is not this Rio a verdant spot, noble captain? Surely you will not keep us always tethered at anchor, when a little more cable would admit of our cropping the herbage. And it is a weary thing, Captain Claret, to be imprisoned month after month on the gun-deck, without so much as smelling a citron." "Ah, Captain Claret, what sings sweet Waller? But who can always on the billows lie? The watery wilderness yields no supply." Compared with such a prisoner, noble captain, happy, thrice happy, who, in battle slain, pressed in Atrides' cause the Trojan pain. Pope's version, sir, not the original Greek. And so saying, Jack once more brought his hat-rim to his mouth, and slightly bending forward, stood mute. At this juncture, the most serene Commodore himself happened to emerge from the after gangway, his gilded buttons, epaulets, and the gold lace on his chapeau glittering in the flooding sunset. Attracted by the scene between Captain Claret and so well-known and admired a commoner as Jack Chase, he approached, and, assuming for the moment an air of pleasant condescension, never shown to his noble barons, the officers of the ward-room, he said with a smile, "Well, Jack, you and your shipmates are after some favor, I suppose. A day's liberty, is it not?" Whether it was the horizontal setting sun streaming along the deck that blinded Jack, or whether it was in sun-worshipping homage of the mighty Commodore, there is no telling. But just at this juncture, noble Jack was standing reverentially holding his hat to his brow, like a man with weak eyes. "Valiant Commodore," said he at last, "this audience is indeed an honor undeserved. I almost sink beneath it. Yes, valiant Commodore, your sagacious mind has truly divined our object. Liberty, sir, liberty is indeed our humble prayer. I trust your honorable wound, received in glorious battle, valiant Commodore, pains you less today than common." "Ah, cunning Jack!" cried the Commodore, by no means blind to the bold sortie of his flattery, but not at all displeased with it. In more respects than one, our Commodore's wound was his weak side. "I think we must give them liberty," he added, turning to Captain Claret, who thereupon, waving Jack further off, fell into confidential discourse with his superior. "Well, Jack, we will see about it," at last cried the Commodore, advancing. "I think we must let you go." "To your duty, Captain of the Maintop," said the captain rather stiffly. He wished to neutralize somewhat the effect of the Commodore's condescension. Besides, he had much rather the Commodore had been in his cabin. His presence, for the time, affected his own supremacy in his ship. But Jack was nowise cast down by the captain's coldness. He felt safe enough, so he proceeded to offer his acknowledgments. "Kind gentlemen," he sighed, "your pains are registered where every day I turn the leaf to read Macbeth, valiant Commodore and Captain, what the Thane says to the noble lords Ross and Angus." And long and lingering, bowing to the two noble officers, Jack backed away from their presence, still shading his eyes with the broad rim of his hat. "Jack Chase forever!" cried his shipmates as he carried the grateful news of liberty to them on the forecastle. "Who can talk to Commodores like our matchless Jack?" End of Chapter 51. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 52 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 52. Something Concerning Midshipmen. It was the next morning after matchless Jack's interview with the Commodore and Captain that a little incident occurred, soon forgotten by the crew at large, but long remembered by the few seamen who were in the habit of closely scrutinizing everyday proceedings. Upon the face of it, it was but a common event, at least in a man of war, the flogging of a man at the gangway. But the undercurrent of circumstances in the case were of a nature that magnified this particular flogging into a matter of no small importance. The story itself cannot here be related; it would not well bear recital. Enough that the person flogged was a middle-aged man of the waist, a forlorn, broken-down, miserable object, truly one of those wretched landsmen sometimes driven into the Navy by their unfitness for all things else, even as others are driven into the workhouse. He was flogged at the complaint of a midshipman, and hereby hangs the drift of the thing. For though this waster was so ignoble a mortal, yet his being scourged on this one occasion indirectly proceeded from the mere wanton spite and unscrupulousness of the midshipman in question, a youth, who was apt to indulge at times in undignified familiarities with some of the men, who, sooner or later, almost always suffered from his capricious preferences. But the leading principle that was involved in this affair is far too mischievous to be lightly dismissed. In most cases, it would seem to be a cardinal principle with a Navy captain that his subordinates are disintegrated parts of himself, detached from the main body on special service, and that the order of the minutest midshipman must be as deferentially obeyed by the seaman as if proceeding from the Commodore on the poop. This principle was once emphasized in a remarkable manner by the valiant and handsome Sir Peter Parker, upon whose death, on a national arson expedition on the shores of Chesapeake Bay, in 1812 or 1813, Lord Byron wrote his well-known stanzas. "By the God of war," said Sir Peter to his sailors, "I'll make you touch your hat to a midshipman's coat, if it's only hung on a broomstick to dry." That the king, in the eye of the law, can do no wrong, is the well-known fiction of despotic states. But it has remained for the navies of constitutional monarchies and republics to magnify this fiction, by indirectly extending it to all the quarter-deck subordinates of an armed ship's chief magistrate. And, though judiciously unrecognized and unacknowledged by the officers themselves, yet this is the principle that pervades the fleet. This is the principle that is every hour acted upon, and to sustain which thousands of seamen have been flogged at the gangway. However childish, ignorant, stupid, or idiotic a midshipman, if he but orders a sailor to perform even the most absurd action, that man is not only bound to render instant and unanswering obedience, but he would refuse at his peril. And if, having obeyed, he should then complain to the captain, and the captain, in his own mind, should be thoroughly convinced of the impropriety, perhaps of the illegality of the order, yet in 9 cases out of 10 he would not publicly reprimand the midshipman, nor by the slightest token admit before the complainant that, in this particular thing, the midshipman had done otherwise than perfectly right. Upon a midshipman's complaining of a seaman to Lord Collingwood, when captain of a line of battle ship, he ordered the man for punishment, and, in the interval, calling the midshipman aside, said to him, "In all probability now, the fault is yours, you know. Therefore, when the man is brought to the mast, you had better ask for his pardon." Accordingly, upon the lad's public intercession, Collingwood, turning to the culprit, said, "This young gentleman has pleaded so humanely for you, that, in hope you feel a due gratitude to him for his benevolence, I will, for this time, overlook your offence." This story is related by the editor of the Admiral's correspondence to show the Admiral's kind-heartedness. Now, Collingwood was, in reality, one of the most just, humane, and benevolent admirals that ever hoisted a flag. For a sea officer, Collingwood was a man in a million. But if a man like him, swayed by old usages, could thus violate the commonest principle of justice, with however good motives at bottom, what must be expected from other captains, not so eminently gifted with noble traits as Collingwood? And if the corps of American midshipmen is mostly replenished from the nursery, the counter, and the lap of unrestrained indulgence at home, and if most of them at least, by their impotency as officers in all important functions at sea, by their boyish and overweening conceit of their gold lace, by their overbearing manner toward the seamen, and by their peculiar aptitude to construe the merest trivialities of manner into set affronts against their dignity, if by all this they sometimes contract the ill will of the seamen, and if, in 1,000 ways, the seamen cannot but betray it, how easy for any of these midshipmen, who may happen to be unrestrained by moral principle, to resort to spiteful practices in procuring vengeance upon the offenders, in many instances to the extremity of the lash. Since, as we have seen, the tacit principle in the Navy seems to be that in his ordinary intercourse with the sailors, a midshipman can do nothing obnoxious to the public censure of his superiors. "You fellow, I'll get you licked before long," is often heard from a midshipman to a sailor who, in some way not open to the judicial action of the captain, has chanced to offend him. At times you will see one of these lads, not 5 feet high, gazing up with inflamed eye at some venerable 6-footer of a forecastleman, cursing and insulting him by every epithet deemed most scandalous and unendurable among men. Yet that man's indignant tongue is treble-knotted by the law, that suspends death itself over his head should his passion discharge the slightest blow at the boy-worm that spits at his feet. But since what human nature is, and what it must forever continue to be, is well enough understood for most practical purposes, it needs no special example to prove that, where the merest boys indiscriminately snatched from the human family are given such authority over mature men, the results must be proportionable in monstrousness to the custom that authorizes this worse than cruel absurdity. Nor is it unworthy of remark that, while the noblest minded and most heroic sea officers, men of the topmost stature, including Lord Nelson himself, have regarded flogging in the Navy with the deepest concern, and not without weighty scruples touching its general necessity, still, one who has seen much of midshipmen can truly say that he has seen but few midshipmen who were not enthusiastic advocates and admirers of scourging. It would almost seem that they themselves, having so recently escaped the posterior discipline of the nursery and the infant school, are impatient to recover from those smarting reminiscences by mincing the backs of full-grown American freemen. It should not be omitted here that the midshipmen in the English Navy are not permitted to be quite so imperious as in the American ships. They are divided into 3, I think, probationary classes of volunteers, instead of being at once advanced to a warrant. Nor will you fail to remark, when you see an English cutter officered by one of those volunteers, that the boy does not so strut and slap his dirk-hilt with a Bobadil air, and anticipatingly feel of the place where his warlike whiskers are going to be, and sputter out oaths so at the men, as is too often the case with the little boys wearing best bower anchors on their lapels in the American Navy. Yet it must be confessed that at times you see midshipmen who are noble little fellows, and not at all disliked by the crew. Besides 3 gallant youths, one black-eyed little lad in particular in the Neversink was such a one. From his diminutiveness, he went by the name of Boat Plug among the seamen. Without being exactly familiar with them, he had yet become a general favorite, by reason of his kindness of manner and never cursing them. It was amusing to hear some of the older Tritons invoke blessings upon the youngster, when his kind tones fell on their weather-beaten ears. "Ah, good luck to you, sir," touching their hats to the little man. "You have a soul to be saved, sir." There was a wonderful deal of meaning involved in the latter sentence. "You have a soul to be saved" is the phrase which a man-of-war's man peculiarly applies to a humane and kind-hearted officer. It also implies that the majority of quarter-deck officers are regarded by them in such a light that they deny to them the possession of souls. Ah, but these plebeians sometimes have a sublime vengeance upon patricians. Imagine an outcast old sailor seriously cherishing the purely speculative conceit that some bully in epaulets, who orders him to and fro like a slave, is of an organization immeasurably inferior to himself, must at last perish with the brutes, while he goes to his immortality in heaven. But from what has been said in this chapter, it must not be inferred that a midshipman leads a lord's life in a man of war. Far from it. He lords it over those below him, while lorded over himself by his superiors. It is as if with one hand a schoolboy snapped his fingers at a dog, and at the same time received upon the other the discipline of the usher's ferule. And though, by the American Articles of War, a Navy captain cannot, of his own authority, legally punish a midshipman, otherwise than by suspension from duty, the same as with respect to the wardroom officers, yet this is one of those sea statutes which the captain, to a certain extent, observes or disregards at his pleasure. Many instances might be related of the petty mortifications and official insults inflicted by some captains upon their midshipmen, far more severe, in one sense, than the old-fashioned punishment of sending them to the mast-head, though not so arbitrary as sending them before the mast to do duty with the common sailors, a custom, in former times, pursued by captains in the English Navy. Captain Claret himself had no special fondness for midshipmen. A tall, overgrown young midshipman, about 16 years old, having fallen under his displeasure, he interrupted the humble apologies he was making by saying, "Not a word, sir. I'll not hear a word. Mount the netting, sir, and stand there till you are ordered to come down." The midshipman obeyed, and, in full sight of the entire ship's company, Captain Claret promenaded to and fro below his lofty perch, reading him a most aggravating lecture upon his alleged misconduct. To a lad of sensibility, such treatment must have been almost as stinging as the lash itself would have been. It is to be remembered that wherever these chapters treat of midshipmen, the officers known as passed midshipmen are not at all referred to. In the American Navy, these officers form a class of young men who, having seen sufficient service at sea as midshipmen to pass an examination before a board of commodores, are promoted to the rank of passed midshipmen, introductory to that of lieutenant. They are supposed to be qualified to do duty as lieutenants, and in some cases temporarily serve as such. The difference between a passed midshipman and a midshipman may also be inferred from their respective rates of pay. The former, upon sea service, receives $750 a year; the latter, $400. There were no passed midshipmen in the Neversink. End of Chapter 52. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 53 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 53. Seafaring persons peculiarly subject to being under the weather. The effects of this upon a man of war captain. It has been said that some midshipmen in certain cases are guilty of spiteful practices against the man-of-war's man. But as these midshipmen are presumed to have received the liberal and lofty breeding of gentlemen, it would seem all but incredible that any of their corps could descend to the paltriness of cherishing personal malice against so conventionally degraded a being as a sailor. So, indeed, it would seem. But when all the circumstances are considered, it will not appear extraordinary that some of them should thus cast discredit upon the warrants they wear. Title, and rank, and wealth, and education cannot unmake human nature. The same in cabin boy and commodore. Its only differences lie in the different modes of development. At sea, a frigate houses and homes 500 mortals in a space so contracted that they can hardly so much as move but they touch. Cut off from all those outward passing things which ashore employ the eyes, tongues, and thoughts of landsmen, the inmates of a frigate are thrown upon themselves and each other, and all their ponderings are introspective. A morbidness of mind is often the consequence, especially upon long voyages, accompanied by foul weather, calms, or headwinds. nor does this exempt from its evil influence any rank on board. Indeed, high station only ministers to it the more, since the higher the rank in a man of war, the less companionship. It is an odious, unthankful, repugnant thing to dwell upon a subject like this. Nevertheless, be it said that, through these jaundiced influences, even the captain of a frigate is, in some cases, indirectly induced to the infliction of corporal punishment upon a seaman. Never sail under a navy captain whom you suspect of being dyspeptic or constitutionally prone to hypochondria. The manifestation of these things is sometimes remarkable. In the earlier part of the cruise, while making a long, tedious run from Mazatlan to Callao on the Main, baffled by light headwinds and frequent intermitting calms, when all hands were heartily wearied by the torrid, monotonous sea, a good-natured foretopman by the name of Candy, quite a character in his way, standing in the waist among a crowd of seamen, touched me and said, "D'ye see the old man there, White Jacket, walking the poop? Well, don't he look as if he wanted to flog someone? Look at him once." But to me, at least, no such indications were visible in the deportment of the captain, though his thrashing the arm-chest with the slack of the spanker out-haul looked a little suspicious. But anyone might have been doing that to pass away a calm. "Depend on it," said the topman, "he must somehow have thought I was making sport of him a while ago, when I was only taking off old Priming, the gunner's mate. Just look at him once, White Jacket, while I make believe coil this here rope. If there aren't a dozen in that 'ere captain's top-lights, my name is Horse Marine. If I could only touch my tile to him now, and take my Bible oath on it, that I was only taking off priming, and not him, he wouldn't have such hard thoughts of me. But that can't be done. He'd think I meant to insult him. Well, it can't be helped. I suppose I must look out for a baker's dozen after long." I had an incredulous laugh at this, but 2 days afterward, when we were hoisting the main-topmast stunsail, and the lieutenant of the watch was reprimanding the crowd of seamen at the halyards for their laziness, for the sail was but just crawling up to its place, owing to the languor of the men, induced by the heat. The captain, who had been impatiently walking the deck, suddenly stopped short, and darting his eyes among the seamen, suddenly fixed them, crying out, "You, Candy, and be damned to you, you don't pull an ounce, you blackguard. Stand up to that gun, sir. I'll teach you to be grinning over a rope that way, without lending your pound of beef to it. Boatswain's mate, where's your colt? Give that man a dozen." Removing his hat, the boatswain's mate looked into the crown aghast. The coiled rope usually worn there was not to be found, but the next instant it slid from the top of his head to the deck. Picking it up and straightening it out, he advanced toward the sailor. "Sir," said Candy, touching and retouching his cap to the captain, "I was pulling, sir, as much as the rest, sir. I was, indeed, sir." "Stand up to that gun," cried the captain. "Boatswain's mate, do your duty." 3 stripes were given, when the captain raised his finger. "You, blank, do you dare stand up to be flogged with your hat on? Take it off, sir, instantly." Footnote: the phrase here used I have never seen either written or printed, and should not like to be the first person to introduce it to the public. End footnote. Candy dropped it on deck. "Now go on, boatswain's mate," and the sailor received his dozen. With his hand to his back, he came up to me where I stood among the bystanders, saying, oh, Lord, that boatswain's mate, too, had a spite agin me. He always thought it was me that set afloat that yarn about his wife in Norfolk. Oh, Lord, just run your hand under my shirt, will you, White Jacket? There. Didn't he have a spite agin me, to raise such bars as them? And my shirt all cut to pieces, too. Arn't it, White Jacket? Damn me, but these coltings puts the 10 in the purser's pocket. Oh, Lord, my back feels as if there was a red-hot gridiron lashed to it. But I told you so. A widow's curse on him, say I. He thought I meant him, and not priming. End of Chapter 53. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 54 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 54. The People are Given Liberty. Whenever, in intervals of mild benevolence, or yielding to mere politic dictates, kings and commodores relax the yoke of servitude, they should see to it well that the concessions seem not too sudden or unqualified. For, in the commoner's estimation, that might argue feebleness or fear. Hence it was, perhaps, that, though noble Jack had carried the day captive in his audience at the mast, yet more than 36 hours elapsed ere anything official was heard of the liberty his shipmates so earnestly coveted. Some of the people began to growl and grumble. "It's turned out all gammon, Jack," said one. "Blast the Commodore," cried another. "He bamboozled you, Jack." "Lay on your oars a while," answered Jack, "and we shall see. We've struck for liberty, and liberty we'll have. I'm your tribune, boys. I'm your Rienzi. The Commodore must keep his word." Next day, about breakfast time, a mighty whistling and piping was heard at the main hatchway, and presently the boatswain's voice was heard. "D'ye hear there, fore and aft? All you starboard quarter watch, get ready to go ashore on liberty." In a paroxysm of delight, a young mizzen-topman, standing by at the time, whipped the tarpaulin from his head and smashed it like a pancake on the deck. "Liberty!" he shouted, leaping down into the berth-deck after his bag. At the appointed hour, the quarter-watch mustered round the capstan, at which stood our First Lord of the Treasury and Paymaster-General, the Purser, with several goodly buckskin bags of dollars piled up on the capstan. He helped us all round to half a handful or so, and then the boats were manned, and, like so many Esterhazys, we were pulled ashore by our shipmates. All their lives, lords may live in listless state, but give the commoners a holiday, and they outlord the Commodore himself. The ship's company were divided into 4 sections or quarter watches, only one of which were on shore at a time, the rest remaining to garrison the frigate, the term of liberty for each being 24 hours. With Jack Chase and a few other discreet and gentlemanly topmen, I went ashore on the first day with the first quarter watch. Our own little party had a charming time. We saw many fine sights, fell in, as all sailors must, with dashing adventures. But though not a few good chapters might be written on this head, I must again forbear. For in this book I have nothing to do with the shore further than to glance at it now and then from the water. My man-of-war world alone must supply me with the staple of my matter. I have taken an oath to keep afloat to the last letter of my narrative. Had they all been as punctual as Jack Chase's party, the whole quarter-watch of liberty-men had been safe on board the frigate at the expiration of the 24 hours. But this was not the case, and during the entire day succeeding, the midshipmen and others were engaged in ferreting them out of their hiding-places on shore, and bringing them off in scattered detachments to the ship. They came in all imaginable stages of intoxication, some with blackened eyes and broken heads, some still more severely injured, having been stabbed in frays with the Portuguese soldiers. Others, unharmed, were immediately dropped on the gun-deck, between the guns, where they lay snoring for the rest of the day. As a considerable degree of license is invariably permitted to man-of-war's men just off liberty, and as man-of-war's men well know this to be the case, they occasionally avail themselves of the privilege to talk very frankly to the officers when they first cross the gangway, taking care, meanwhile, to reel about very industriously, so that there shall be no doubt about their being seriously intoxicated, and altogether non corpus for the time. And though but few of them have cause to feign intoxication, yet some individuals may be suspected of enacting a studied part upon these occasions. Indeed, judging by certain symptoms, even when really inebriated, some of the sailors must have previously determined upon their conduct, just as some persons who, before taking the exhilarating gas, secretly make up their minds to perform certain mad feats while under its influence, which feats consequently come to pass precisely as if the actors were not accountable for them. For several days, while the other quarter watches were given liberty, the Neversink presented a sad scene. She was more like a madhouse than a frigate. The gun-deck resounded with frantic fights, shouts, and songs. All visitors from shore were kept at a cable's length. These scenes, however, are nothing to those which have repeatedly been enacted in American men of war upon other stations. But the custom of introducing women on board in harbor is now pretty much discontinued, both in the English and American Navy, unless a ship, commanded by some dissolute captain, happens to lie in some faraway outlandish port in the Pacific or Indian Ocean. The British line of battleship Royal George, which in 1782 sunk at her anchors at Spithead, carried down 300 English women among the 1,000 souls that were drowned on that memorable morning. When, at last, after all the mad tumult and contention of liberty, the reaction came, our frigate presented a very different scene. The men looked jaded and wan, lethargic and lazy, and many an old mariner, with hand upon abdomen, called upon the flagstaff to witness that there were more hot coppers in the Neversink than those in the ship's galley. Such are the lamentable effects of suddenly and completely releasing the people of a man of war from arbitrary discipline. It shows that, to such, liberty, at first, must be administered in small and moderate quantities, increasing with the patient's capacity to make good use of it. Of course, while we lay in Rio, our officers frequently went ashore for pleasure and, as a general thing, conducted themselves with propriety. But it is a sad thing to say that as for Lieutenant Mad Jack, he enjoyed himself so delightfully for 3 consecutive days in the town, that upon returning to the ship he sent his card to the surgeon, with his compliments, begging him to drop into his stateroom the first time he happened to pass that way in the wardroom. But one of our surgeon's mates, a young medico of fine family but slender fortune, must have created by far the strongest impression among the hidalgos of Rio. He had read Don Quixote, and, instead of curing him of his quixotism, as it ought to have done, it only made him still more quixotic. Indeed, there are some natures concerning whose moral maladies the grand maxim of Mr. Similia similibus curantur Hahnemann does not hold true, since, with them, like cures not like, but only aggravates like. Though, on the other hand, so incurable are the moral maladies of such persons that the antagonist maxim contraria contraris curantar often proves equally false. Of a warm tropical day, this surgeon's mate must needs go ashore in his blue cloth boat cloak, wearing it with a gallant Spanish toss over his cavalier shoulder. By noon he perspired very freely, but then his cloak attracted all eyes, and that was huge satisfaction. Nevertheless, his being knock-kneed and spavined of one leg sorely impaired the effect of this hidalgo cloak, which, by the way, was somewhat rusty in front, where his chin rubbed against it, and a good deal bedraggled all over, from his having used it as a counterpane off Cape Horn. As for the midshipmen, there was no knowing what their mammas would have said to their conduct in Rio. 3 of them drank a good deal too much, and when they came on board, the captain ordered them to be sewed up in their hammocks, to cut short their obstreperous capers till sober. This shows how unwise it is to allow children, yet in their teens, to wander so far from home. It more especially illustrates the folly of giving them long holidays in a foreign land, full of seductive dissipation. "Port for men, claret for boys," cried Dr. Johnson. Even so, men only should drink the strong drink of travel. Boys should still be kept on milk and water at home. Middies, you may despise your mother's leading strings, but they are the man-ropes, my lads, by which many youngsters have steadied the giddiness of youth and saved themselves from lamentable falls. And middies, know this, that as infants, being too early put on their feet, grow up bandy-legged and curtailed of their fair proportions, even so, my dear middies, does it morally prove with some of you, who prematurely are sent off to sea. These admonitions are solely addressed to the more diminutive class of midshipmen, those under 5 feet high, and under 7 stone in weight. Truly, the records of the steerages of men of war are full of most melancholy examples of early dissipation, disease, disgrace, and death. Answer, ye shades of fine boys, who in the soils of all climes, the round world over, far away sleep from your homes. Mothers of men, if your hearts have been cast down when your boys have fallen in the way of temptations ashore, how much more bursting your grief did you know that those boys were far from your arms, cabined and cribbed in by all manner of iniquities. But this some of you cannot believe. It is, perhaps, well that it is so. But hold them fast. All those who have not yet weighed their anchors for the Navy, round and round, hitch over hitch, bind your leading strings on them, and clenching a ring bolt into your chimney jam, moor your boys fast to that best of harbors, the hearthstone. But if youth be giddy, old age is stayed, even as young saplings, in the litheness of their limbs, tossed to their roots in the fresh morning air. But, stiff and unyielding with age, mossy trunks never bend. With pride and pleasure be it said that, as for our old Commodore, though he might treat himself to as many liberty days as he pleased, yet throughout our stay in Rio, he conducted himself with the utmost discretion. But he was an old, old man, physically a very small man. His spine was as an unlocked musket barrel, not only attenuated, but destitute of a solitary cartridge, and his ribs were as the ribs of a weasel. Besides, he was Commodore of the fleet, supreme lord of the commons in blue. It beseemed him, therefore, to erect himself into an ensample of virtue, and show the gun-deck what virtue was. But alas, when virtue sits high aloft on a frigate's poop, when virtue is crowned in the cabin a Commodore, when virtue rules by compulsion and domineers over vice as a slave, then virtue, though her mandates be outwardly observed, bears little interior sway. To be efficacious, virtue must come down from aloft, even as our blessed Redeemer came down to redeem our whole man-of-war world, to that end mixing with its sailors and sinners as equals. End of Chapter 54. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Chapter 55 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 55. Midshipmen Entering the Navy Early. The allusion in the preceding chapter to the early age at which some of the midshipmen enter the Navy suggests some thoughts relative to more important considerations. A very general modern impression seems to be that in order to learn the profession of a sea officer, a boy can hardly be sent to sea too early. To a certain extent, this may be a mistake. Other professions involving a knowledge of technicalities and things restricted to one particular field of action are frequently mastered by men who began after the age of 21, or even at a later period of life. It was only about the middle of the 17th century that the British military and naval services were kept distinct. Previous to that epoch, the King's officers commanded indifferently either by sea or by land. Robert Blake, perhaps one of the most accomplished and certainly one of the most successful admirals that ever hoisted a flag, was more than half a century old, 51 years, before he entered the naval service, or had aught to do, professionally, with a ship. He was of a studious turn, and, after leaving Oxford, resided quietly on his estate, a country gentleman, till his 42nd year, soon after which he became connected with the parliamentary army. The historian Clarendon says of him, "He was the first man that made it manifest that the science (seamanship) might be attained in less time than was imagined." And doubtless it was to his shore sympathies that the well-known humanity and kindness which Blake evinced in his intercourse with the sailors is, in a large degree, to be imputed. Midshipmen sent into the Navy at a very early age are exposed to the passive reception of all the prejudices of the quarter-deck in favor of ancient usages, however useless or pernicious. Those prejudices grow up with them and solidify with their very bones. As they rise in rank, they naturally carry them up, whence the inveterate repugnance of many commodores and captains to the slightest innovations in the service, however salutary they may appear to landsmen. It is hardly to be doubted that, in matters connected with the general welfare of the Navy, government has paid rather too much deference to the opinions of the officers of the Navy, considering them as men almost born to the service, and therefore far better qualified to judge concerning any and all questions touching it than people on shore. But in a nation under a liberal constitution, it must ever be unwise to make too distinct and peculiar the profession of either branch of its military men. True, in a country like ours, nothing is at present to be apprehended of their gaining political rule, but not a little is to be apprehended concerning their perpetuating or creating abuses among their subordinates, unless civilians have full cognizance of their administrative affairs, and account themselves competent to the complete overlooking and ordering them. We do wrong when we in any way contribute to the prevailing mystification that has been thrown about the internal affairs of the National Sea Service. Hitherto, those affairs have been regarded even by some high state functionaries as things beyond their insight, altogether too technical and mysterious to be fully comprehended by landsmen. And this it is that has perpetuated in the Navy many evils that otherwise would have been abolished in the general amelioration of other things. The Army is sometimes remodeled, but the Navy goes down from generation to generation almost untouched and unquestioned, as if its code were infallible and itself a piece of perfection that no statesman could improve. When a Secretary of the Navy ventures to innovate upon its established customs, you hear some of the Navy officers say, "What does this landsman know about our affairs? Did he ever head a watch? He does not know starboard from larboard, girt line from backstay." While we deferentially and cheerfully leave to Navy officers the sole conduct of making and shortening sail, tacking ship, and performing other nautical manoeuvres, as may seem to them best, let us beware of abandoning to their discretion those general municipal regulations touching the well-being of the great body of men before the mast. Let us beware of being too much influenced by their opinions in matters where it is but natural to suppose that their long-established prejudices are enlisted. End of Chapter 55. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 56 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 56. A Shore Emperor on Board a Man of War. While we lay in Rio, we sometimes had company from shore, but an unforeseen honor awaited us. One day, the young Emperor Don Pedro II and suite, making a circuit of the harbor and visiting all the men of war in rotation, at last condescendingly visited the Neversink. He came in a splendid barge rowed by 30 African slaves, who, after the Brazilian manner, in concert rose upright to their oars at every stroke, then sank backward again to their seats with a simultaneous groan. He reclined under a canopy of yellow silk, looped with tassels of green, the national colors. At the stern waved the Brazilian flag, bearing a large diamond figure in the center, emblematical, perhaps, of the mines of precious stones in the interior, or, it may be, a magnified portrait of the famous Portuguese diamond itself, which was found in Brazil, in the district of Tejuco, on the banks of the Rio Belmonte. We gave them a grand salute, which almost made the ship's live oak knees knock together with the tremendous concussions. We manned the yards and went through a long ceremonial of paying the Emperor homage. Republicans are often more courteous to royalty than royalists themselves, but doubtless this springs from a noble magnanimity. At the gangway, the Emperor was received by our Commodore in person, arrayed in his most resplendent coat and finest French epaulets. His servant had devoted himself to polishing every button that morning with rotten stone and rags. Your sea air is a sworn foe to metallic glosses, whence it comes that the swords of sea officers have, of late, so rusted in their scabbards that they are with difficulty drawn. It was a fine sight to see this Emperor and Commodore complimenting each other. Both were chapeaux de bras, and both continually waved them. By instinct, the Emperor knew that the venerable personage before him was as much a monarch afloat as he himself was ashore. Did not our Commodore carry the sword of state by his side? For though not borne before him, it must have been a sword of state, since it looked far too lustrous to have been his fighting sword. That was naught but a limber steel blade, with a plain, serviceable handle, like the handle of a slaughterhouse knife. Who ever saw a star when the noon sun was in sight? But you seldom see a king without satellites. In the suite of the youthful Emperor came a princely train, so brilliant with gems that they seemed just emerged from the mines of the Rio Belmonte. You have seen cones of crystallized salt? Just so flashed these Portuguese barons, marquises, viscounts, and counts. Were it not for their titles, and being seen in the train of their lord, you would have sworn they were eldest sons of jewelers all, who had run away with their fathers' cases on their backs. Contrasted with these lamp lustres of barons of Brazil, how waned the gold lace of our barons of the frigate, the officers of the gun-room! And compared with the long, jewel-hilted rapiers of the marquises, the little dirks of our cadets of noble houses, the middies, looked like gilded tenpenny nails in their girdles. But there they stood, Commodore and Emperor, lieutenants and marquises, middies and pages. The brazen band on the poop struck up, the marine guard presented arms, and high aloft, looking down on this scene, all the people vigorously hurrahed. A topman next to me on the main royal yard removed his hat, and diligently manipulated his head in honor of the event. But he was so far out of sight in the clouds that this ceremony went for nothing. A great pity it was that, in addition to all these honors, that admirer of Portuguese literature, Viscount Strangford of Great Britain, who, I believe, once went out ambassador extraordinary to the Brazils, it was a pity that he was not present on this occasion, to yield his tribute of a stanza to Braganza. For our royal visitor was an undoubted Braganza, allied to nearly all the great families of Europe. His grandfather, John VI., had been King of Portugal. His own sister, Maria, was now its queen. He was, indeed, a distinguished young gentleman, entitled to high consideration, and that consideration was most cheerfully accorded him. He wore a green dress coat with one regal morning star at the breast, and white pantaloons. In his chapeau was a single bright golden-hued feather of the imperial toucan fowl, a magnificent, omnivorous, broad-billed, banded bird of prey, a native of Brazil. Its perch is on the loftiest trees, whence it looks down upon all humbler fowls, and, hawk-like, flies at their throats. The toucan once formed part of the savage regalia of the Indian caciques of the country, and upon the establishment of the empire was symbolically retained by the Portuguese sovereigns. His Imperial Majesty was yet in his youth, rather corpulent if anything, with a carefree, pleasant face, and a polite, indifferent, and easy address. His manners, indeed, were entirely unexceptionable. Now here, thought I, is a very fine lad, with very fine prospects before him. He is supreme emperor of all these Brazils. He has no stormy night watches to stand. He can lay abed of mornings just as long as he pleases. Any gentleman in Rio would be proud of his personal acquaintance, and the prettiest girl in all South America would deem herself honored with the least glance from the acutest angle of his eye. Yes, this young emperor will have a fine time of his life, even so long as he condescends to exist. Everyone jumps to obey him, and see, as I live, there is an old nobleman in his suit. The Marquis de Carty, they call him, old enough to be his grandfather, who, in the hot sun, is standing bareheaded before him, while the emperor carries his hat on his head. "I suppose that old gentleman now," said a young New England tar beside me, "would consider it a great honor to put on his Royal Majesty's boots. And yet, White Jacket, if yonder emperor and I were to strip and jump overboard for a bath, it would be hard telling which was of the blood royal when we should once be in the water. Look you, Don Pedro II," he added, "how do you come to be emperor? Tell me that. You cannot pull as many pounds as I on the main topsail halyards. You are not as tall as I. Your nose is a pug, and mine is a cutwater. And how do you come to be a brigand with that thin pair of spars? A brigand, indeed!" "Braganza, you mean," said I, willing to correct the rhetoric of so fierce a republican, and by so doing chastise his censoriousness. "Braganza bragger it is," he replied, "and a bragger indeed. See that feather in his cap? See how he struts in that coat? He may well wear a green one, top mates. He's a green-looking swab at the best." "Hush, Jonathan," said I. "There's the first duff looking up. Be still. The emperor will hear you." And I put my hand on his mouth. "Take your hand away, White Jacket," he cried. "There's no law up aloft here. I say, you emperor, you greenhorn in the green coat there, look you can't raise a pair of whiskers yet. And see what a pair of homeward bounders I have on my jowls. Don Pedro, eh? What's that, after all, but plain Peter? Reckoned a shabby name in my country. Damn me, White Jacket, I wouldn't call my dog Peter." "Clap a stopper in your jaw tackle, will you?" cried Ringbolt, the sailor on the other side of him. "You'll be getting us all into darbies for this." "I won't trice up my red rag for nobody," retorted Jonathan. "So you had better take a round turn with yours, Ringbolt, and let me alone, or I'll fetch you such a swat over your figurehead, you'll think a long wharf truck horse kicked you with all four shoes on one hoof. You emperor, you counter-jumping son of a gun, cock your weather eye up aloft here, and see your betters. I say, topmates, he ain't any emperor at all. I'm the rightful emperor. Yes, by the Commodore's boots, They stole me out of my cradle here in the Palace of Rio and put that greenhorn in my place. You timberhead, you! I'm Don Pedro II, and by good rights you ought to be a main-topman here with your fist in a tar bucket. Look you, I say, that crown of yours ought to be on my head, or if you don't believe that, just heave it into the ring once and see who's the best man. What's this hurrah's nest here aloft? Cried Jack Chase, coming up the topgallant rigging from the topsail yard. Can't you behave yourself, royal yardman, when an emperor's on board? It's this here Jonathan, answered Ringbolt. He's been blackguarding the young nob in the green coat there. He says Don Pedro stole that hat. How? Crown, he means, noble Jack, said a topman. Jonathan don't call himself an emperor, does he? asked Jack. Yes, cried Jonathan. That greenhorn standing there by the Commodore is sailing under false colors. He's an impostor, I say. He wears my crown. Ha, ha, laughed Jack, now seeing into the joke and willing to humor it. Though I'm born a Briton, boys, yet by the mast these Dom Pedros are all Perkin Warbecks. But I say, Jonathan, my lad, don't pipe your eye now about the loss of your crown, for look you, we all wear crowns, from our cradles to our graves, and though in double darbies in the brig, the Commodore himself can't unking us. A riddle, noble Jack. Not a bit. Every man who has a sole to his foot has a crown to his head. Here's mine. And so saying, Jack, removing his tarpaulin, exhibited a bald spot just about the bigness of a crown piece on the summit of his curly and classical head. End of chapter 56. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Chapter 57 of White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, by Herman Melville. Chapter 57. The Emperor Reviews the People at Quarters. I begged their Royal Highnesses' pardons all round, but I had almost forgotten to chronicle the fact that with the Emperor came several other royal princes, kings for aught we knew, since it was just after the celebration of the nuptials of a younger sister of the Brazilian monarch to some European royalty. Indeed, the Emperor and his suite formed a sort of bridal party, only the bride herself was absent. The first reception over, the smoke of the cannonading salute having cleared away, and the martial outburst of the brass band having also rolled off to leeward, the people were called down from the yards, and the drum beat to quarters. To quarters we went, and there we stood up by our iron bulldogs, while our royal and noble visitors promenaded along the batteries, breaking out into frequent exclamations at our warlike array, the extreme neatness of our garments, and, above all, the extraordinary polish of the bright work about the great guns, and the marvelous whiteness of the decks. "Que gusto!" cried a marquis, with several dry goods, samples of ribbon, tallied with bright buttons, hanging from his breast. "Que gloria!" cried a crooked, coffee-colored vicomte, spreading both palms. "Que alegria!" cried a little count, mincingly circumnavigating a shot-box. "Que contentamento e o meio!" cried the Emperor himself, complacently folding his royal arms and serenely gazing along our ranks. Pleasure, glory, and joy, this was the burden of the three noble courtiers, and very pleasing indeed was the simple rendering of Don Pedro's imperial remark. "Aye, aye," growled a grim rammer and sponger behind me, "it's all devilish fine for you nobs to look at, but what would you say if you had to holy stone the deck yourselves, and wear out your elbows in polishing this cursed old iron, besides getting a dozen at the gangway if you dropped a grease spot on deck in your mess? Aye, aye, devilish fine for you, but devilish dull for us. In due time the drums beat the retreat, and the ship's company scattered over the decks. Some of the officers now assumed the part of cicerones, to show the distinguished strangers the bowels of the frigate, concerning which several of them showed a good deal of intelligent curiosity. A guard of honor, detached from the Marine Corps, accompanied them, and they made the circuit of the berth deck, where, at a judicious distance, the Emperor peeped down into the cable tier, a very subterranean vault. The captain of the main hold, who there presided, made a polite bow in the twilight, and respectfully expressed a desire for his Royal Majesty to step down and honor him with a call. But with his handkerchief to his imperial nose, His Majesty declined. The party then commenced the ascent to the spar deck, which, from so great a depth in a frigate, is something like getting up to the top of Bunker Hill Monument from the basement. While a crowd of people was gathered about the forward part of the booms, a sudden cry was heard from below. A lieutenant came running forward to learn the cause, when an old sheet-anchorman, standing by, after touching his hat, hitched up his waistbands, and replied, "I don't know, sir, but I'm thinking as how one of them 'ere kings has been tumbling down the hatchway." And something like this it turned out. In ascending one of the narrow ladders leading from the berth deck to the gun deck, the most noble Marquis of Silva, in the act of elevating the imperial coat-tails so as to protect them from rubbing against the newly painted combings of the hatchway, this noble Marquis's sword, being an uncommonly long one, had caught between his legs, and tripped him, head over heels, down into the fore-passage. "Onde ides?" "Where are you going?" said his royal master, tranquilly peeping down toward the falling Marquis. "And what did you let go of my coat-tails for?" he suddenly added, in a passion, glancing round at the same time, to see if they had suffered from the unfaithfulness of his train-bearer. "Oh, Lord!" sighed the captain of the foretop, "who would be a Marquis of Silva?" Upon being assisted to the spar-deck, the unfortunate Marquis was found to have escaped without serious harm. But from the marked coolness of his royal master, when the Marquis drew near to apologize for his awkwardness, it was plain that he was condemned to languish for a time under the royal displeasure. Shortly after, the imperial party withdrew, under another grand national salute. End of Chapter 57. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista.